A rich and arrogant daughter mocked an old man's broken shoes in the street. That same night, when she discovered it was her grandfather, she began to cry without console. The night enveloped the family's immense mansion with a veil of glitter and ostentation. The soft music of a grand piano rose above the murmur of elegant conversations, creating a refined and almost unreal atmosphere. Men in impeccable tuxedos and women in dresses from the season's most exclusive designers filled the main hall, savoring delicately served appetizers on silver trays. Floral arrangements, carefully placed on the tables, and sumptuous crystal lamps reinforced the luxurious ambience. In every corner, an apparent generosity was felt, a philanthropy proclaimed with rehearsed smiles and measured gestures. Jenna, around 20 years old, wandered among the guests with the confidence of someone who knows she is at the top. Her ivory-toned dress shimmered under the lights, highlighting the subtle jewelry adorning her neck and wrists. However, there was a distant expression in her eyes, an indifference meticulously polished. To every businessman, politician, or celebrity who spoke to her, she responded with perfect courtesy, a soft but empty smile. If someone mentioned the social causes motivating the evening, Jenna nodded without enthusiasm, as if the final destination of the donations was a minor detail, something irrelevant within the machinery of her privileged world. At the center of the scene, on an improvised stage, George, Jenna's father, delivered a speech with a calculated tone. With a firm voice and a satisfied gesture, he praised the family's company's social responsibility, as if that virtue were just another branch of the empire he had built. Every word he spoke seemed rehearsed to please the attendees, showcasing impeccable but soulless philanthropy. Meanwhile, Eleanor, Jenna's mother, listened silently, standing beside the podium. Her hands tensed as she clapped, and there was a sort of buried discomfort in her gaze, a trace of tension she couldn't entirely hide. Among the crowd, Clara, Jenna's best friend, felt out of place. She wasn't dressed in excessively expensive clothes or ostentatious jewelry. Her simplicity stood out amidst the opulence. From the periphery of the hall, she watched Jenna with a slightly furrowed brow. She knew her friend from everyday life, from university, where she was kind and fun. But there, before that absorbed elite, Jenna appeared haughty, almost despising everything she considered inferior. Uncomfortable, Clara stepped away from the conversation when her friend made disparaging comments, unable to recognize in that frivolous and arrogant attitude the same person she so cherished. After the speech concluded, toasts arose with feigned enthusiasm. Champagne glasses were raised in unison, reflecting the lamps and creating a fleeting sparkle. Jenna, feeling more bored than anything else, excused herself gracefully and headed to the garden. There, under the starry sky, she gazed at the mansion's exterior lights, the artificial glow of the ongoing party inside. The night breeze caressed her face, but failed to cool her vanity or awaken her empathy. To her, that gala was just another showcase, a stage to reaffirm her status and her advantage over the rest of the world. The fate of the charitable funds was a marginal note, an irrelevant nuance lost amidst the clinking of glasses and the sparkle of jewelry. Jenna smiled to herself, satisfied without really knowing why. She never imagined that that night, so seemingly perfect, would mark the beginning of a crack in her impeccable world. For now, she limited herself to enjoying the moment, convinced that everything was as it should be, her above, others below, and the truth of what was happening around her relegated to a mere backdrop. The party's murmur had dissipated. After the gala, the family and the last guests left the mansion, filtering into the night's quiet. A clear sky and fresh air embraced the silent streets. Jenna, with her perfect dress still immaculate, walked calmly, while Clara stayed by her side, more thoughtful than ever. The contrasting tranquility outside seemed a counterpoint to the ostentation experienced moments before. The driver, standing next to the luxurious black car, waited patiently. On the sidewalk, Most pedestrians were neighbors returning home in a hurry and with discretion. A street vendor, now without goods to offer, slowly pushed an empty cart, dreaming of the bed that awaited him after an exhausting day. Just at that moment, when the night seemed to wrap itself in its own silence, an old man approached from the shadows. His clothes, old and faded, looked as tired as his body. His unkempt grey hair fell over a forehead lined with deep wrinkles. Of all the details that highlighted his precariousness, perhaps his shoes, the cracked ones with soles almost detached, caught Jenna's attention the most. His steps were slow, timid, as if he feared invading a space that did not belong to him. "Excuse me," the man murmured with a low, weary voice. "Could you help me with some change?" The request was soft, humble, and perhaps for that reason, more heartbreaking in that recent atmosphere of luxury. Clara felt a pang in her chest and stood still, not knowing what to say. From the party, she had carried the uncomfortable memory of Jenna's words, her disdainful attitude, and now she felt that this scene was an ironic and painful continuation of the night. Jenna, on the other hand, stopped to contemplate the beggar with a cold expression. She looked at him intently, scrutinizing his appearance, and her gaze settled especially on his shoes. Clara barely dared to breathe, suspecting that her friend's response would not be what the man needed or deserved. "Do you come from the same museum as those shoes?" Jenna snapped in a mocking tone, the ridicule as sharp as it was unnecessary. Her words slid through the nighttime silence like an icy snap. The old man, who had just unveiled his vulnerability by asking for change, stood petrified. He did not beg, did not protest, he just let the humiliation settle over him like a layer of dust. His eyes reflected a dull bitterness, the kind of sorrow that arises when one understands that human dignity can be shattered with a sigh of cruelty. After what felt like eternal moments, the man turned around and walked away without saying anything. The sound of his steps on the sidewalk echoed in Clara's consciousness, who remained stunned, unable to articulate a word in defense of the old man. The family, the driver, the guests, all witnessed the scene, and the collective silence was as cruel as Jenna's mockery. "Let's go," George said impatiently, as if he wanted to distance himself from that tension. The driver opened the car's back door. Jenna got in without showing the slightest remorse. She seemed satisfied with her wit, as if her mocking remark had been a gem of social ingenuity. Clara, still paralyzed, settled beside her with a furrowed brow, feeling like an involuntary accomplice of that moral misery. As the car started and the mansion faded behind them, no one could imagine what that scene had truly left. It was not just an old man humiliated, but a crack, an echo of shame and pain that would later resonate in everyone's lives. For now, however, the night continued its course, with the indifference of someone who still ignores the consequences that fate will reveal. The night grew increasingly silent as the mansion's lights dimmed. After the gala and the uncomfortable episode in the street, Jenna tried to convince herself that nothing had changed. However, the memory of the old man's tired gaze slid through her mind, emerging at the least expected moment. With a slight exhale of annoyance, she headed toward the attic, obeying Elena's request. She needed to distract herself, and that dusty corner full of trunks and forgotten boxes promised to keep her occupied for a while. Upon opening the attic door, a slight creak greeted her. The air was thick, with the smell of old wood and yellowed paper. Next to a small window, barely a faint moonlight filtered in, enough to illuminate the undefined shapes of obsolete furniture and outdated decorations. Jenna, still dressed in her party clothes, moved among stacked boxes and ancient suitcases. Her heels echoed on the creaky wooden floorboards, creating faint sounds. "Where could that bag be?" she murmured, moving one box after another. Some contained photo albums, picture frames, silver ashtrays with engraved initials, and hand-embroidered handkerchiefs. It was like unearthing a life she didn't know, one that had been left behind before she was born. While moving a heavy box, she tripped over a photo album wrapped in cloth. She opened it out of curiosity, flipping through pages filled with black and white snapshots or with faded color. Unfamiliar people smiled back at her from the past. Old parties, picnic days, family gatherings. Suddenly, one image caught her attention. Her mother, Eleanor, as just a child. She was sitting on the lap of a middle-aged man, smiling, with a presence that emanated warmth. That smile, the contour of the jaw, the sparkle in the eyes. Something about that face seemed strangely familiar. Jenna felt a churn in her stomach. She didn't know why, but the expression of that man reminded her of the old man's lost gaze in the street. The shape of his nose, the slight droop of his eyelids, the curve of his smile. They were features she had seen just hours ago. She carefully closed the album and, with the photo in hand, descended the attic stairs, her heart beating faster than usual. She found her in the living room, sitting in front of the extinguished fireplace. Elena had her gaze fixed on the dead embers, lost in some corner of her memory. When Jenna showed her the photo, her mother paled instantly. A slight tremor ran through her hands, and her breathing became irregular. "Who is he, Mom?" Jenna asked, trying to sound more curious than accusatory, although the concern was evident in her voice. Eleanor wanted to turn the photo away, to put it away, to hide it in the past. But her daughter did not relent. She insisted with her gaze, with the question. On the verge of tears, Eleanor gave in. Her voice was barely a whisper. "That man is my father, your grandfather, Julian." Jenna felt a chill freeze her blood. Her grandfather? She had grown up believing that her grandfather was a vague memory, someone always absent. He was always talked about as a missing person, a man lost in some dark chapter of the family. Now, that photo showed him smiling, alive, close. "My grandfather," she repeated, incredulous. "But you said that—" Elena let out a sob. The words hurt her throat, the weight of years of silence falling upon her. "The old man you humiliated today. That man was Julian, your grandfather." Jenna froze, the photo still clutched in her fingers. Her breath turned into a handful of knots in her chest. The image of the beggar with broken shoes resurfaced in her mind and overlapped with the man in the photo, smiling, kind, full of life. She felt a sharp pang, a mix of guilt and astonishment. "No, it can't be," she murmured, shaking her head. Her eyes filled with rebellious tears that she didn't want to show. "Why? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Elena didn't respond. Her crying was her only answer. Between sobs, she bowed her head, overcome by a shame she had been hiding for years. Jenna stood paralyzed, not knowing whom to blame first. Her mother, her father, herself. Faced with this revelation, she understood with a dull thud that she had hurt her own blood, a man who was part of her identity, to whom she owed part of her existence. With the photo trembling in her hand, Jenna silently withdrew. She felt small, confused, full of questions that no one seemed willing to answer. In her chest, guilt grew, dark and relentless, while the shadows of the past began to creep into every corner of the house, demanding to be seen in the light of truth. Morning arrived laden with invisible tension in the mansion. The sun streamed through the windows with its usual light, but for Jenna, nothing seemed the same. The revelation from the previous night kept turning over in her mind. A knot had formed in her stomach, and her hands sweated as she headed to her father's study. Now that she knew the truth, or at least part of it, she couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. George was behind his desk, surrounded by meticulously organized folders. He attended calls with a confident tone, giving brief and precise instructions as if the world operated at his whim. When Jenna entered, he barely looked up for a second before continuing to leaf through documents. His study was a place that conveyed control and efficiency. There, silence and order were unbreakable rules. Dad. Jenna broke the silence with a voice thread that she didn't recognize as her own. Her heart pounded loudly. What's wrong, Jenna? I'm busy, George replied without looking up, with that impassive tone he always used when he wanted to keep his distance. Jenna swallowed and approached the desk. Leaning slightly forward, she dared to ask the question burning in her throat. I want to know about Julian, my grandfather. Why did you never talk to me about him? Why? She was interrupted, remembering the humiliating scene from the previous night, the old man in the street, her own cruelty, and the revelation that had left her frozen. Why didn't you tell me the truth? This time George did look at her, but his expression remained stone-like, almost indifferent. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if calculating the most convenient response. He set the papers aside, reclined in his leather chair, and with a serene voice said, Jenna, there are things from the past that are better left untouched. Matters that stayed behind for the good of the family. Your grandfather. He paused for a second, searching for the words. There's no point in digging into stories that won't bring you anything good. At the side of the door, without Jenna noticing when she entered, stood Elena. Her mother had witnessed the encounter, silent, with her gaze lowered and nervous hands. Upon hearing George's neutral voice, more evasive than firm, Eleanor felt a shiver. She didn't dare to intervene, afraid of shaking the family facade she had so strived to maintain. Jenna clenched her fists, noticing the coldness in each of her father's words. Nothing good? For whom, Dad? She insisted, with a determination she didn't even know she possessed. I want to know who my grandfather is, understand why he ended up like this. Why you told me he was missing. George narrowed his eyes, as if gauging his daughter's impetus. Finally, he simply shrugged indifferently. There's nothing to understand. Let it be, Jenna. Our life is now, not decades ago. We gain nothing by reopening old wounds. A heavy silence settled in the room. Jenna realized she wouldn't get any more answers there. Her father was a wall of silence, a barrier between her and the past. Eleanor, without saying a word, turned around and left the study, taking her own remorse with her. Jenna stayed a few more seconds contemplating George, waiting for some hint of empathy that never came. Later that same afternoon, Jenna called Clara. She needed to vent to someone who wasn't involved in the web of family secrets. Meeting at a cafe, Clara listened to the story in disbelief. Your grandfather? The man from last night was your grandfather? How didn't you know anything? Jenna felt a blush of shame climb up her neck. She looked down and admitted with a shaky voice, I never asked, Clara. I assumed I didn't have grandparents or that they had died. I lived in a bubble where only events, what people would say, and luxuries mattered. I never cared about my own family history. Now, I feel like I need to know everything. Clara frowned, feeling sorry, but her gaze reflected sincere compassion. It's understandable that you're confused, but if your family doesn't want to talk, you'll have to seek answers on your own. Jenna nodded, realizing that her father's silence, Elena's crying, the prevailing coldness in the mansion, were the first clues of a deeper enigma. She could no longer pretend to be unaware, nor did she want to. She had to find the truth, not only to mend the harm she had unknowingly caused, but also to understand why her surname was wrapped in a veil of secrets that no one dared to tear apart. She said goodbye to Clara with a tense but necessary hug. Now, with guilt gnawing at her conscience and curiosity pushing her forward, Jenna understood that her life would never be the same. The facade of her family was no longer impeccable in her eyes. Behind her father's silence lay a moral void that she was now, for the first time, willing to confront. The next day, Jenna left the safe refuge of the mansion and ventured into territory she barely knew. Common streets, corners with street vendors, neighborhoods where luxury wasn't the norm. Alongside her went Clara, whom she had called in the morning and who came without hesitation, driven more by concern for her friend than by any real hope. Still, Clara understood that this step was necessary. Jenna needed to look around without filters, to step out of the perfect bubble and embrace what it meant to belong to a family that kept so many secrets. They walked through avenues and alleys, asking pedestrians, merchants selling fresh fruit or small snacks from makeshift carts. The task wasn't easy. The image Jenna had etched in her mind was that of the old man she had mocked and an ephemeral presence she had encountered only moments ago. A tired face, grey hair, worn clothes and shabby shoes were her only clues. But how many homeless elderly men could there be in such a large city? "Excuse me, have you seen an older man with grey hair, with the sole of his shoe almost detached?" Jenna repeated the question over and over. Her tone, once haughty, was now more hesitant. She no longer felt like the owner of the world, but a stranger in that environment. Most shrugged, shook their heads, or gave vague responses. After a couple of hours, Clara noticed the fatigue in her friend's eyes, but also determination. Jenna wouldn't give up so easily, not after learning that the man she had humiliated was her own blood. "Try over there," Clara suggested, pointing to a flower stand on the corner. "The owner seems friendly." Jenna nodded and approached. The florist, a middle-aged man with hands roughened by outdoor work, greeted her with a tired smile. Upon hearing the description of Julian, he stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Yes, I think I know who you're talking about. An old man who shows up here from time to time, doesn't ask for much, sometimes buys a single cheap flower or just stands looking at the stand. I've heard he goes to a community dining hall a few blocks from here." He pointed to an imprecise address with his finger. "I can't promise anything, but I've seen him stop by there occasionally." Jenna felt an unexpected relief. It was a clue, a point on the map she could follow. She thanked the florist and with her neat handwriting wrote down the street name. Clara, beside her, watched the scene attentively. For the first time since they started the search, there was a concrete lead. "Jenna," Clara said softly, contrasting the tension of the moment. "When you find your grandfather, don't just offer him an apology. Try to understand what happened. How does someone who was a co-founder of a family business end up on the street? There's a story behind every wound." Jenna looked at her seriously. She recognized the truth in her friend's words. Before, she would have been offended by any suggestion that she should understand people without her status. Now, guilt and curiosity had opened a gap in her arrogance. She nodded, taking a deep breath, with calm determination. "I will, Clara. I can't fix anything if I don't uncover the complete truth." With those words, the young heiress understood that her path was no longer just an attempt to repair a momentary mistake, but the necessity to unearth the truth that her family had so far camouflaged. As the sun descended on the horizon, both set off towards the community dining hall, with the promise not to turn back until they understood why Julian had been erased from her family's official narrative. The door of the community dining hall was a peeling wooden sheet that kept no secrets. It let voices seep through, along with the smell of hot soup and the hum of conversations interrupted by the clinking of spoons against cheap stoneware plates. Jenna and Clara entered with hesitant steps. There were no marble tables or fine crystal here, only wooden benches and simple steaming pots. The light inside was warm, coming from modest lamps, and the atmosphere held a coziness that contrasted with the indifference of the mansion. As the two young women moved forward, several gazes fell upon Jenna. Her clothes, her bearing, and the faint scent of expensive perfume did not belong in that place. Clara, simpler in appearance, blended in a bit better, but her friend's presence revealed a different world. There were children with soup-stained hands, old men sipping broth in silence, and a few adults exchanging stories in half-whispers. No one wore elegant suits or fine jewelry. Yet here, need and solidarity were the norm. Behind an improvised counter, a robust woman with her hair tied up in a bun and a firm gaze ladled out portions of soup. Seeing Jenna and Clara, She raised her eyebrows curiously. Without hostility, but with a certain surprise, she invited them to come closer. Her name was Clara, and in her calloused hands and deep voice, it was clear that she ran the place without pompous speeches. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, adjusting another pot over the fire. The soup gave off a delicious, simple, comforting aroma. Jenna took a step forward and swallowed, trying to steady the tremor in her voice. "We're looking for an older man. His name is Julian. He's grey-haired, somewhat stooped, usually wears worn-out clothes. They told me he sometimes comes here." Sarah tilted her head, thinking. It didn't take much effort for her to place the description. "Yes, Julian. I've seen him. He comes by once in a while. Sometimes he takes a bowl of soup. Other times he just sits in a corner reading old newspapers I managed to get around here. He doesn't talk much, but he's polite, you can tell. He never complains, never raises his voice. He seems like someone who knows of other things, other times, as if he once had a different future." Jenna felt a lump in her throat. Hearing Sarah describe her grandfather unsettled her. Until now, her image of the homeless had been so flat, so limited. Julian wasn't just some beggar drifting through nothingness. He was someone with a story, a past. That detail weighed heavily on her conscience. "Does he say anything about his former life?" she persisted softly. Sarah shook her head while stirring the soup. "Almost never. I've only heard him mention that he used to work at something big, a company, many years ago. But he falls silent quickly, as if talking about it hurt. There's a dull sorrow in his eyes. Some people come here angry, with complaints, but he carries a heavy silence, like an old wound that no amount of hot food or goodwill can heal." Clara watched Jenna, noticing the change in her expression. Once haughty, now her gaze reflected painful unease, a tremor of guilt. The young heiress was slowly understanding that her grandfather was not the worthless old man she had ridiculed for sport, but a learned, sensitive man, marked by suffering she knew nothing about. And instead of offering him a helping hand, she had thrown more dirt on the wound. Sarah noticed Jenna's pained look and softened her tone. "I don't know what your relationship with him is, but if you ever want to help, maybe starting by listening would be enough. We don't give out luxuries here, just a bowl of soup and a quiet place. But sometimes, a willing ear is worth more than any banquet." Jenna nodded, unable to speak. Clara stepped closer and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. That experience was changing the perspective on everything she had taken for granted. Her family, her status, the people she had considered inferior, were so much more than background figures in her world. Julian had a name, a past, his own pain and dignity. When they left the dining hall, the afternoon breeze caressed their faces. Jenna, silent, thought about Sarah's words. Her grandfather asked for nothing more than a quiet corner and perhaps some understanding, and she had treated him with the coldest cruelty. Now, with her hands balled into trembling fists, Jenna prepared to move forward, determined to discover how, where, and why her grandfather's life had taken such an unjust turn. Several blocks away from the community dining hall and the places Jenna traversed searching for her grandfather, the journalist Matthew worked quietly, immersed among dusty shelves. The yellowish light of the municipal archives lamp made motes of dust shine in the air, and the distant hum of old machines was the only sound accompanying the calm breathing of that restless, tireless man. Matthew was the kind of journalist who didn't settle for lightweight stories. His nose for hidden tales, for incomplete truths, had earned him a reputation as a stubborn type, sometimes inconvenient, but often accurate. Months earlier, some hints about irregularities in the management of a very prestigious family company had landed in his hands, a company whose philanthropic facade and luxurious fame didn't quite convince him. He had already heard rumors, financial fraud, names disappearing from official records without explanation, partners who vanished mysteriously over time. That afternoon, with the methodical patience of someone reconstructing an ancient puzzle, Matthew leafed through yellowed newspapers. He found articles praising Jenna's family business, then smaller, just taking its first steps. Between the faded lines, he came across a name rarely mentioned in contemporary official history: Julian. According to an almost forgotten clipping, Julian appeared as one of the founders of that company, a key figure in its early days. But that was all. The trail vanished after a few mentions, and he couldn't find any later references explaining what had become of that figure. "Julian?" Matthew murmured, rubbing his chin, intrigued. "Who was this man, and why isn't he mentioned now?" As he went on, he found broken references, documentary gaps, vague suspicions. A financial report hinted that at some point someone opposed shady practices within the company. After that, only silence. Matthew shook his head, feeling that there had been deliberate stumbles, concealed gaps, as if someone had made an effort to erase Julian from history. He continued searching until nightfall. When he left, his notebook filled with scattered notes and his head spinning, Matthew was convinced he had found a loose end. Rumors of past fraud, the figure of a founder erased from the map, all pointed to a hushed scandal. He still didn't know the connection between Julian and the present, knew nothing about the painful family tie linking that man to Jenna. But he sensed he was about to uncover something big, something beyond mere accounting: irregularities. As he closed the archive door behind him and stepped into the night, Matthew still didn't know the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. But his instinct told him this story would be different from the others, and that Julian's name, lost in the folds of time, would be the key to opening the doors of the past and challenging the prestige built on dark foundations. The air felt heavier than usual as Elena headed to the private residence where her maternal uncle Hector lived. The journey, which used to be a periodic formality to ensure the old man was in good hands, now held a different meaning. The silence in the car seemed like a constant whisper of guilt and shame. Everything she had tried to ignore for years now churned in her mind and became unbearable. Upon arrival, a kindly-faced nurse guided her to Hector's room. He, over 80 years old, still displayed a certain dignity in his posture, but his tired eyes showed indifference. At first, he didn't even greet her pleasantly. Elena's visits felt more like a routine check than an act of affection. She sat facing him, holding her breath, unsure where to begin. "Uncle, I've come to talk to you about my father," Elena finally said, her voice trembling. That name, Julian, rang out like an echo in the carpeted room, adorned with antiques and family portraits. Hector raised his gaze, a rough gleam in his pupils, perhaps surprise, perhaps a silent reproach for how long it had taken her to dare utter that forbidden name. "Your father," he whispered, in a dragged, almost incredulous tone. "It's about time someone remembered him for who he was." Eleanor felt a painful throbbing in her temples. She had expected evasions or lies, but not such a direct acknowledgement. Hector, initially apathetic, ended up sighing, as if letting go of that secret were a relief he had feared for too long. "I always knew Julian hadn't disappeared, as they said. He lived on the margins." Hector paused, choosing his words. "No one looked for him. No one dared lend a hand. And he never stopped trying." Hearing this, Elena understood the magnitude of the betrayal. A harsh guilt clawed at her throat. Then Hector, without too much preamble, opened a wooden drawer and took out a bundle of letters tied with an old ribbon. The yellowed paper and handwritten addresses spoke of years of waiting and withered hope. "These are the letters," Hector said, offering them to her. "He sent them regularly. In them he asked to see you, then to meet your daughter, the granddaughter he never got to embrace. He begged for a chance at reconciliation. But his words crashed against a wall of silence. No one answered, no one returned them, no one gave him the slightest reason to keep believing in the family." Elena took the bundle with trembling hands. As she glanced over those letters, tears came uninvited. How many times had she chosen not to ask? How long had she preferred to accept the official story without questioning anything. Now she knew. Each act of omission was another brick in the wall that had isolated Julian from his own family. "The truth cannot be hidden forever," Hector said in a hoarse but firm voice. "You've kept silent. You've allowed it. And now you have to face the consequences. Your father didn't deserve this fate." Elena stood up with the letters clutched to her chest, unable to meet her uncle's gaze. She understood that her complicity had fueled a cruel lie. The family, so proud of its reputation, had erased a good man from the map, reducing him to a street ghost. She left the residence with uncertain steps, fearing the effect these revelations would have on the precarious family balance. Especially she feared for Jenna, who had already begun to glimpse the truth. With each letter, with each line written by Julian, Eleanor felt the weight of the responsibility for staying silent grow heavier. Those letters were a testament of love and ignored regret, a silent plea now making its way through the family opulence that aimed to be impeccable. As the sun declined over the street, Elena knew that this bundle of letters would change everything. Her daughter could no longer live in the bubble of deceit, and she herself would have to face the past without more lies. The community dining hall had emptied a bit when Jenna, her head full of questions, headed toward a corner where Sarah was waiting for her. The woman discreetly pointed to an older couple sitting in the back, near a window through which the soft light of the evening sun streamed in. Jacob and Olivia held simple coffee cups in their hands, sipping small gulps and sharing silences full of complicity. They seemed like a couple that had withstood the passage of time with stoicism. Jenna approached hesitantly, fearing to intrude. But upon mentioning Julian's name, the elderly couple's eyes lit up with a nostalgia devoid of reproach. Olivia gestured for her to sit beside them. Without ceremony, without formality, those two strangers seemed willing to unveil the past just to rescue the name of a man they remembered fondly. "Did you know Julian?" Jenna asked in a low voice, as if afraid to break some spell. Jacob nodded slowly. His hands, weathered from years of work, gripped the coffee cup firmly. His eyes, darkened by experience, sparkled for a moment. "Of course," he replied in a deep voice. "Decades ago, when your family's company was much smaller, Julian worked there. I don't know exactly what his position was, maybe a kind of founding partner or an influential manager. But what I do remember is that he defended the employees. If there were injustices, he raised his voice. It didn't matter if the abuser was a high executive or an ambitious foreman, Julian was there to remind them what was right." Jenna felt a chill. Her grandfather, of whom there was barely a vague image, turned out to be a moral pillar within the company. It was hard to associate that figure with the trembling, humiliated old man she had found on the street. He protested against unfair wage cuts, pushed to improve working conditions, Olivia added, sweetening her voice with the warmth of someone recalling a forgotten hero. "I remember hearing that thanks to him, some colleagues kept their jobs during tough times. We felt protected, knowing that someone on the employer's side advocated for us. He was a beacon, you know, a guide in the midst of a troubled sea." Jenna swallowed, trying to fit all these new pieces together. She never imagined that her family, with all its opulence, had a past of internal struggles, of disputes over the treatment of workers. She also hadn't imagined her grandfather as a brave and empathetic man who stood up against those who abused their power. She had grown up on a sweetened story where the company was an example, not a moral battleground. "And what happened after?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jacob and Olivia exchanged a bitter glance. It was Olivia who spoke. "One day, without warning, Julian disappeared. No one said anything. He simply stopped coming. In the company, a strange silence took over the atmosphere. No one raised their voice anymore for fear. It seemed the management had imposed a tacit censorship, and shortly after, the company grew more easily. Without Julian's presence, without that critical voice, everything became more comfortable for those at the top. Jenna felt a knot in her throat. That didn't sound like a man who had left of his own accord. It sounded like someone erased from the map, removed from the official narrative to clear the path for expansion. Her grandfather wasn't a homeless man without a past. He was an upright man pushed into oblivion. The young woman noticed her own hands trembling a bit, and Clara, standing behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support. Now she understood that Julian hadn't disappeared by chance. There was something more sinister behind the story. He was a thorn in the side of those who preferred silence and profit over justice. And that thorn had been thrown far away, left to fall onto the street, into nothingness, turning that decent man into an old man with worn shoes, ignored by his own descendants. "Thank you," Jenna murmured, unable to say more. Jacob and Olivia nodded, understanding that they had shed light on a dark passage. When the young heiress stood up, her gaze had changed. There was no longer arrogance or blind innocence. Now she knew Julian's moral height and the depth of the betrayal that condemned him. Inevitably, those truths planted the seed of a new determination within her, the urgency to restore the dignity taken from her grandfather. For several days, Jenna walked through streets and corners, followed confusing directions, and asked everyone who seemed to know the old man. With Jacob and Olivia's words echoing in her memory, her determination had strengthened. It was no longer just about calming her guilt. She wanted to understand, to ask for forgiveness, and to show that she didn't want to perpetuate the family's injustice. Each new clue brought her closer to the elusive figure of her grandfather and reminded her that the path to redemption would not be easy. Finally, the answers led her to a quiet corner of the city, a modest public library nestled in a simple neighborhood. It had nothing to do with the sumptuous reading rooms of her mansion. There, the silence was thick, interrupted only by the turning of pages and the whisper of students engrossed in old manuals. The air smelled of aged paper, unfinished wood, and quiet knowledge. Jenna entered with her heart racing. She walked slowly among ancient shelves, whose book spines seemed to witness stories barely remembered. In a corner, lit by a tired lamp, she recognized Julian's figure. He was hunched over yellowed newspapers, leafing through them with an almost ritualistic slowness. Seeing him like this, Jenna felt a pang of pain. That man, her grandfather, had been someone brave and just, and now he took refuge in old news, perhaps searching the past for something of the life that had been taken from him. Gathering her courage, she approached softly, trying not to startle him. When she was just a few steps away, she spoke in a restrained voice. "Excuse me," she whispered, trying to control the tremor in her throat. I want to apologize for what happened that night." Julian looked up slowly. Recognizing her, his gaze shifted from confusion to contained fury. His eyes shone with pure, indescribable resentment. For an eternal second, Jenna saw reflected in that look all the contempt she had spat at him that time, now turned into a mirror that made her feel despicable. "Are you here to laugh again?" Julian snapped, his voice rough and laden with bitterness. Jenna felt her blood run cold. She wanted to say 1,000 things, that she knew who he was, that she had discovered his story and the injustice he suffered. She wanted to explain that she wasn't the same frivolous girl, that she had realized her grandfather's value and the horror that had silenced him. But the words stuck in her throat, unable to emerge coherently. She barely managed to mumble some meaningless syllables. Julian didn't wait any longer. He closed the newspaper with a snap, stood up with wounded dignity, and walked away, leaving Jenna standing on the ground. She took a few steps after him, trying to catch up, trying to explain herself. But the old man continued his firm pace, ignoring her voice that could barely emerge in a pleading whisper. When she left the library, Julian had already disappeared into the streets. Jenna stopped, disoriented. The stillness of the surroundings seemed cruel. She had arrived there hoping for a reunion, for a first bridge toward understanding. But her good intentions weren't enough. Years of hurt and silence don't heal with an "I'm sorry" thrown into the air. With a heavy heart, she realized that her grandfather had no reason to believe her. She was a stranger, a belated granddaughter who appeared with excuses after publicly humiliating him. She realized that the path to regain his trust, if it was even possible, would be long and thorny. She left the library with her gaze fixed on the ground, feeling the weight of each step, the doubt of whether Julian could ever see her without that silent fury, without the pain that had marked his entire life. Now she knew that forgiveness isn't begged for, it's earned. And to earn it, she would have to do much more than apologize. She would have to give Julian back something that her family had taken away, something more valuable than money or fame, his dignity. The family company's boardroom, usually a refuge of spotless calm, looked strangely desolate that morning. George, Jenna's father, was seated in his leather chair behind a polished table, but his posture lacked the usual confidence. Beside him, Baron, his partner and right-hand man, drummed his fingers impatiently on the glass surface, tapping out an anxious rhythm. Both shared a palpable tension, an uncomfortable silence broken only by the distant noise of phones ringing in adjacent offices. Years of success and expansions had forged the reputation of that company, enveloping it in a halo of social admiration and calculated philanthropy. Now, the mere mention of Julian seemed like a wedge threatening to shatter that shine into 1,000 pieces. George was torn between disbelief and anger. How was it possible that a man they had managed to confine to oblivion was reappearing just now? "They are snooping around," Baron warned, finally breaking the silence. He lowered his voice as he spoke, as if the room might have ears. "There are rumors of a journalist, Matthew, who is going through old files. And your daughter," Baron emphasized the last word with a grimace. "Your daughter has dangerously approached her grandfather. If that truth comes to light—" George shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The mention of Jenna unsettled him, especially because he knew his daughter's stubbornness once she set a goal. Now that she had uncovered part of the hidden story, he feared she might unearth the rest. He felt a chill imagining his family dragged through the media mud. "We can't allow it," George murmured firmly, his tone low but resonating in the dimly lit room like a command. If Julian becomes a symbol, if someone proves he was a co-founder, or if those irregularities come to light, he preferred not to say the word frauds, though it hovered in his mind. It could ruin everything we've built. Baron nodded slowly, weighing the options. His ambition was pragmatic. He had no hesitation in convincing witnesses with money to silence mouths. In other cases, an intimidating letter, a reminder of the consequences of speaking out, sufficed. Perhaps they could silence Jacob, Olivia, anyone willing to pronounce Julian's name in public. That journalist, Matthew, could also be persuaded to look the other way. And Julian was a marginal old man who would listen to him. "There are solutions for this," Baron commented, in an almost indifferent tone, as if discussing an inventory adjustment. "We can make generous offers to those who know too much, and if they don't accept, we can make them understand the consequences of meddling where they're not wanted." George didn't respond, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. They had gone too far in the past, and apparently they were willing to keep digging the corruption well to protect their empire. Part of him felt nauseous, but he didn't stop. The fear of downfall was greater than the disgust for the means to avoid it. By the door, trying to go unnoticed, Sydney, the company's internal lawyer, listened discreetly. Until then, her loyalty had been unquestionable. She handled maintaining legal formalities, drafting favorable contracts, ensuring that family power remained intact. But this time, the way George and Baron spoke of bribes, intimidations, eliminating obstacles, shook her. What kind of past were they talking about? Sydney didn't have all the details, but she understood that what they were hiding was serious. Julian wasn't just an untimely homeless person. He was someone with a fundamental role in the company's history. And if they were willing to do anything to maintain silence, How much more would they have to cover up? Sydney felt a tightness in her chest. She wondered how far her professional obligation extended and where her moral responsibility began. Was it her duty to protect the interests of a family that seemed to have no ethical limits? She glanced at George's tense figure, Baron's furrowed brow, and wondered if her loyalty had a price or a limit. She knew that, just like the past they were trying to bury, the truth would eventually surface. And when that happened, on which side of the story did she want to be? The pressure mounting on the company was increasing, and with each dark decision, the architecture of the family's prestige cracked a little more. The afternoon was grey when Matthew, the journalist, arrived at Lucio's modest residence. A gentle wind blew, carrying the scent of damp earth, and in the distance, the distant roar of urban traffic could be heard. The apartment building where the former accountant lived bore no resemblance to the elegant offices of Jenna's family business. It was an unpretentious concrete block with small balconies and clothes hanging in the sun. A curious neighbor watched him pass, but Matthew was too focused on his search to notice those furtive glances. It took Matthew some time to find the correct apartment. He climbed 3 floors using a narrow staircase, avoiding the damp stains on the walls and the sharp chirp of a canary he couldn't see. Finally, he stood before the door indicated on the paper he held tightly in his fingers. He knocked softly. There was silence, then the dragging of feet and a dry cough echoed through the wood. When the door opened, he found himself face to face with Lucio, a man in his 70s, hunched and appearing fragile. His hands trembled slightly, and his gaze was that of someone who had lived long enough to accumulate guilt he could no longer ignore. He wore a worn sweater and wide pants, sporting simple slippers. His skin was pale, and his hair, grey and thinning, was awkwardly combed back. Behind him, the apartment's interior was simple: a small living room with a tattered armchair, a table with coffee stains, some disorganized stacked books, and an old radio whispering static. "Are you Lucio?" Matthew asked politely. "I've been told you worked as an accountant in Jenna's family business, for Julian." Mentioning Julian changed Lucio's demeanor. His eyes clouded with memory. There was a moment of hesitation, as if he was debating whether to slam the door in the journalist's face or let him in. Finally, with a long sigh, Lucio stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Matthew noticed the smell of medicine and reheated soup, the discreet poverty of old age in solitude. "Close the door," Lucio's voice was raspy. "No one must hear this, though I doubt anyone would bother spying on me at this hour." Matthew obeyed and took a seat on a chair with chipped varnish. Lucio settled into the armchair, coughing hard, and took a minute to steady his breathing. The journalist waited in silence. He knew it wasn't wise to press the sick and possibly guilty man. He hoped that guilt and the passage of time had softened Lucio's tongue. "You're looking for the truth about Julian, aren't you?" Lucio said plainly. Matthew nodded, pulling out his notebook. Before he began writing, he wanted Lucio to speak without feeling the pressure of the pen scratching the paper. He gave him space and time. "Julian was a co-founder of the company," Lucio continued with a weary voice. "An honest man, too honest for those with twisted ambitions. He defended the employees, questioned unfair decisions, demanded transparency. And that, in the end, became an obstacle for those who wanted to expand without limits, trampling on rights and values." Coughing interrupted him again, and Lucio took a sip of water from a nearby glass. "He was a thorn in the side, and he had to be removed." Matthew's skin crawled. The image of Julian he had pieced together through documents, rumors, and fragmented testimonies was taking shape. An upright man who sacrificed his stability for labor justice. "Julian was accused of embezzlement," Lucio continued with a hint of shame. "It was all a setup. Documents were forged, balances were adjusted. I participated." His hands trembled more violently. "I signed false papers, altered numbers. I did it under pressure. They threatened to take my job, my pension, my future. And I gave in." I wasn't the only one, but that doesn't excuse me. I was young, I was scared, had small ambitions, and they offered security in exchange for silence. Lucio's voice broke slightly. Matthew noticed the glimmer of tears in the old man's eyes. For decades, that accountant had lived with that weight on his shoulders. He had contributed to sinking the reputation of an honorable man, expelling him from the business world to cast him into the open. Now, facing that unknown journalist, he might have been seeking a moral respite, the relief of confession. "Who pressured for this plot?" Matthew asked gently, trying not to sound aggressive. "I need names, dates, evidence." Lucio hesitated for a moment, looking at the bare walls of his living room. Then he stood up with effort and went to a small cabinet. He opened a drawer and pulled out a bundle of yellowed documents, letters with old letterheads, copies of contracts marked with handwritten annotations. Placing them on the table, Matthew knew he had found the most valuable treasure of his investigation, concrete evidence of how Julian had been betrayed. Here are copies of the adulterated financial statements. Here, internal letters instructing how to incriminate Julian. Lucio dropped the last sheet with a sigh. "This doesn't redeem me, I know, but I can't die with this secret buried. Julian deserved justice, and at least now maybe someone knows the truth." Matthew flipped through the papers with his heart pounding. The figures, the signatures, the stamps, everything pointed to a large-scale conspiracy. Well-known family names, exact dates of meetings, Lucio's shaky signature alongside others. It was a web of lies woven to tarnish Julian, expel him from the business and the official narrative, to then build the family empire on rotten foundations. "Thank you, Lucio," Matthew said softly, with sincere respect. He knew the man was risking himself by breaking years of silence. "Don't thank me," Lucio replied with a bitter gesture. "I should apologize to Julian, but I don't know if he'd listen to me. I don't even know where he is now. I just hope this truth serves more than just a newspaper article. There's a broken heart behind these numbers." The room fell silent, except for Lucio's heavy breathing. Matthew closed his notebook, aware that he held the story that would overturn the family's reputation. Now he fully understood the picture. The old man on the street was the betrayed co-founder, a victim of a voracious machinery of greed and appearances. Jenna's family fortune, the one they flaunted at charity galas, was partly built on a heinous betrayal. As he left the apartment, Matthew felt the fresh air hit his face. He leaned his back against the hallway wall and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to absorb the weight of his discovery. His fingers clenched the notebook tightly, aware that the story could explode at any moment, that the world needed to know it. As he descended the narrow stairs, he thought of Julian, of Jenna, of the humble people that the man had defended, of the arrogance of those who had expelled him. All of them would be implicated in the impending earthquake. The journalist left with a firm step, determined not to let go of the thread he had found, to pull it until every dirty piece of that story was brought to light and shown to the world. Inside the mansion, the hours seemed to pass with unusual thickness. The opulence of the salons, the noble wooden furniture, the antique paintings, all became burdensome. It was as if the luxury shone less, now without the innocent gaze with which Jenna had once admired it. Now every object, every tapestry, every flower in the vase was a reminder of the dark foundations that sustained that deceptive harmony. Eleanor, standing next to a side table in the main lounge, held a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with an old faded ribbon. Her hands trembled as Jenna, seated in a velvet armchair, watched her with uncertainty. For days, tension had seeped into every corner of the house, but that afternoon, the atmosphere was different, a mixture of shame, guilt, and the imminence of a truth that could no longer be hidden. "Jenna," Eleanor said in a faint voice, this belongs to you too. These are your grandfather's letters." Upon hearing the word grandfather, Jenna felt a knot in her throat. Since she had learned the truth, her entire life had been tinged with painful revelations. Julian was not a stranger, nor a mere elderly, homeless man. He was her family, her blood, and she had treated him like trash. Now, seeing those envelopes, she knew that each one contained the muted plea of a man who had been erased from the official narrative. Elena handed her the letters without daring to look her in the eyes. Jenna noticed that her mother was on the verge of tears. Gathering her courage, she took the bundle of envelopes. There were dozens, perhaps more than 100, all yellowed, some with bent corners, others with barely legible stamps. Dates spanning decades, letters sent persistently year after year in search of a response that never came. With trembling hands, Jenna opened the first envelope, dated many years ago when she was still a child. Julian's handwriting was clear, meticulous, with the traits of someone who grew up in times when calligraphy was still an art. In that first letter, he wrote tenderly, "My dear Elena, I hope you are well. I want to see you, to know how you have lived. I know my absence hurt you, but it was not by my will. I need to explain myself. I need you to let me be part of your life, even if it's from a distance. I have heard through rumors that you have a daughter. How is she? Please, respond to me, I beg you. I want to meet my granddaughter, even if it's through your words." Jenna couldn't hold back her tears. As she continued reading, Julian's voice became more desperate. Another letter, written years later, read, "Eleanor, I insist because I don't want to give up. Why do you ignore me? Don't I deserve at least a line, a sentence? Is the supposed crime I committed so unforgivable? I have lived on the margins, but I am still your father. I want to meet Jenna. I don't seek anything material. I just wish to feel that I am not dead to you. Answer me, please." Each word was a dagger. Jenna felt the ground beneath her feet crumbling. How had they been able to ignore those pleas? How had they allowed Julian to wander in exile, begging for a family bond that never arrived? Elena, sobbing, collapsed into an armchair in front of her daughter. She tried to speak, but the words came out broken. I was afraid, Jenna. Your father, George, he said we shouldn't stir up that past, that Julian was a burden, a dead name, a risk to the company. I preferred not to see, not to ask. I kept these letters unopened, unanswered. I wanted to believe the version they told me. I wanted to live in the comfort of the lie. And so, I let my father suffer in oblivion." Jenna cried silently, tears sliding down her cheeks unopposed. Her breathing was heavy, and the pain added to the anger, guilt, and remorse. It was no longer just the financial fraud or the business betrayal that tainted that story. It was the cruelty of omission, the denial of a man's dignity who had given his life for his family. With each letter she read, she suffocated a little more at the magnitude of the grievance. Some read, "I am sick, Elena. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I don't want to die without seeing you, without knowing that I am not a ghost in your memory. Were my sins that severe? Don't I deserve one last chance to explain myself?" Jenna must be a young woman by now. How does she dress? What does she study? What does she aspire to? She is my granddaughter, my blood. I would give what I don't have to be able to hug her once, to tell her that her grandfather didn't abandon her, that someone else broke the ties. Please, Elena, answer me. Jenna covered her face with one hand, unable to continue reading. Her mother watched her with eyes swollen from guilt. The silence in the room was dense, only interrupted by the soft ticking of an old clock that seemed to mark every second of accumulated pain. "No, I can't believe we did this," Jenna murmured, her voice broken. "It's not just the money nor the company. It's his dignity, his humanity, what we have denied him. I humiliated him without knowing he was my grandfather. And even if I had known, would it have made any difference before all this came to light?" Her words were directed at herself, acknowledging the pride with which she had lived. Eleanor knelt before her, taking her daughter's hands in her own. "I'm sorry, Jenna. I have been a coward. I preferred to live in a lie rather than face the truth. I have no excuses. I can only ask for your forgiveness for having raised you in this empty bubble, for having deprived you of knowing a grandfather who deserved love and respect." Jenna lifted her gaze, her face streaked with tears. She couldn't forgive her mother at that moment, nor herself. But something burned in her chest. A new fire, a determination to do what was right. It was no longer enough to lament. She had to act. "Mom," she said with a trembling but firm voice, "this can't stay like this. Julian needs to know that I'm sorry, that we regret it. I can't give him the decades lost, but I can show him that we won't continue denying his truth. We must do something, clear his name, repair the damage, even if it's late." Elena nodded, sobbing. For the first time in a long time, understanding the magnitude of her guilt was visible in her eyes. It would be a long and painful path. But as Jenna looked at the letters scattered on the side table, she understood that she couldn't continue as before. She couldn't allow silence to continue imposing itself over justice and compassion. The pain drove her to stand up, to confront her father, the company, everyone who had stayed silent. Julian deserved more than late pity. He deserved his place in the family history, his truth vindicated, and, if he wished, an opportunity to belong, to be heard. With a heavy heart, Jenna understood that the time had come to open the sealed windows of the past, let light into the darkest corners, and face the consequences of a truth denied for too long. There, surrounded by those letters that never reached their destination, an unbreakable conviction was born within her. She would do everything possible for Julian to know that, finally, someone was listening. After leaving the lounge with the scattered letters on the side table, Jenna retired to her room. A dense silence filled the mansion's hallways. She no longer heard the muffled echo of confident steps on thick carpets, nor the soft murmur of insubstantial conversations from pretentious guests. The house, once a stage of ostentation, now seemed a mausoleum for relegated truth. Every painting, every porcelain vase felt useless and hollow, mute witnesses to what had happened within those walls. Once in her room, Jenna carefully closed the door, as if fearing to wake ghosts. Inside, everything was impeccably ordered. The dressing table with its expensive perfumes, the jewelry she once flaunted with arrogance, the closet filled with costly dresses. An entire life built on the idea that aesthetics and refinement were enough to define her. Now, all of that seemed repugnant to her. She sat on the bed, hands on her trembling knees, and let the pain flood her. Tears flowed easily, washing away the mascara and the masks on her face. She cried for herself, for her grandfather, for her mother, and for the lost time. She cried for the blind complicity with which she had grown up, for the contempt she had shown towards the inferiors. She cried upon realizing that, unknowingly, she had been part of the machinery that kept Julian exiled from the family world. She had been raised with the conviction that opulence was a merit, when, in reality, part of that wealth had been amassed with the pain and silencing of someone who deserved justice. The bedroom door opened a few minutes later. Clara, timidly, peeked her head in. She had waited in the hallway, hesitating whether to interrupt, but Jenna's sobs pushed her to enter. Seeing Jenna with swollen eyes and smudged makeup, Clara approached carefully and sat beside her without saying a word at first. She simply enveloped her with a warm and understanding arm. "Val," she finally said softly, "what's wrong?" Jenna breathed heavily, trying to organize her thoughts. How could she summarize the chaos within her? She traced the impeccable bedspread with her fingers, trying to find the right words, but there was nothing orderly in her mind. So, between sobs, she let it all out at once. Her grandfather's truth, the ignored letters, the manipulation, the betrayal, her own humiliation of a defenseless man. and the discovery that this man was her blood. Clara listened with wide eyes, consternation etched on her furrowed brow. When Jenna finished speaking, a long silence ensued. Her friend looked at her with a mixture of pity and respect, not judging her, but inviting her to take the next step. "Jenna," Clara finally said, with that tenderness that had always been her greatest quality, "I know it hurts. I know your world is falling apart. But you can't stay here crying forever. You have power, influence, resources. If you truly care about your grandfather, do something. Don't remain in regret without action. Guilt without change is useless." Jenna wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Her face looked tired, but a new light shone in her eyes. For the first time, she understood that submitting to the lie, letting herself be carried away by the family mandate, had been a choice, albeit unconscious. Now, the choice had to be different, to fight for the truth. "You're right," she murmured with a hoarse voice. "I can't turn back time, but I can try to repair some of all this damage. I have lived in a bubble where the truth didn't matter, where my only goal was to be recognized, admired, envied, where people's worth was measured by their money or their origins. That's over." Clara nodded, happy to see that fire in her friend. "Your grandfather deserves you to defend him, to show with actions that you're not on the side of those who betrayed him. It won't be easy. You'll have to confront your father, the people who always applauded you without questioning, those who think money cleans all sins. But if you truly value justice, do it." Jenna took a deep breath. The idea of confronting her father, George, made her skin crawl. She knew he wouldn't easily admit the truth, that he would see her quest as a betrayal to the family, as foolishness. She also feared the reactions of other members of the business circle, of supposed friends who would look down on her if she stopped being the spoiled and submissive girl. But she could no longer ignore what she had discovered. She understood that true courage wasn't measured by money or status, but by the willingness to do what's right, when the easy choice is to stay silent. "I will do it," Jenna said with conviction, wiping away her last tears. "I will make my grandfather know that I'm sorry, that I understand his pain, and that I won't allow this injustice to remain forgotten. I want the truth to be known, to clear his name, so that he can at least feel that not all of his own blood has rejected him." Clara smiled, proud of her friend. The arrogant and superficial Jenna seemed to dissolve before her eyes, giving way to a more aware, more human young woman. It was sad that the moral awakening came wrapped in so much suffering, but at least it had arrived. Compassion, pain, and guilt were opening a path to responsibility in Jenna. "You can count on me," Clara said, squeezing her hand. "It won't be easy. You might lose things in the process. Interested friendships, unnecessary luxuries, or the admiration of those who only wanted your image. But you'll regain something more valuable: integrity." Jenna nodded, looking out her bedroom window. The garden, once perfect and unchanging, now seemed like a fragile stage, a facade. She now needed to leave that bubble, to face the grime hidden under the carpet. She had to talk to her father, to her mother, to the partners, to anyone who had contributed to the silence. And above all, she had to search for Julian again, not with empty excuses, but with proof that she was willing to expose the truth and restore his stolen dignity. Determination made her feel lighter, although the knot of guilt remained. She knew the path would be long and difficult, but she could no longer live in the comfort of ignorance. Something had awakened in her, a sense of justice, honesty, empathy that she had never known before. Her moral awakening was authentic and painful, but necessary. "Let's do it," Jenna concluded, squeezing Clara's hand like a silent pact. In that room where luxury and vanity once reigned, a new Jenna was born. One who, with her still trembling knees, was about to raise her voice, demand answers, and repair the damage. The echo of sobs faded, giving way to a firm will to confront the past, and hopefully reconcile with her own humanity. When Jenna left the mansion that morning, she did so with a firm purpose. In a leather briefcase, she carried a folder carefully organized the night before. Inside, each sheet, each letter, each document was a brick to rebuild a bridge broken decades ago. She felt that most of her life had passed without ever questioning the cracks that hid her world. And now, for the first time, she had the irresistible urge to illuminate the darkest corners. She had chosen to return to the small neighborhood library, the same place where her grandfather had recently rejected her. She understood that if Julian was hiding his silences, his readings, his need for a quiet space there, it was because that corner offered him what the family denied him, the possibility to exist without being humiliated, without being watched. Jenna arrived early, before the hour Julian usually appeared, and sat in a corner, keeping the briefcase on her lap. Morning light discreetly entered through the windows, caressing the old shelves and the worn wooden floorboards. In those dusty halls, there were no jewels or designer dresses, but authenticity was palpable. The smell of old paper and unknown lives hidden among the book spines. Time passed slowly. Jenna flipped through a couple of old magazines, not really reading them, waiting for her grandfather to appear. Her heart pounded. She knew that simply showing up and apologizing again wasn't enough. This time she carried something more valuable: evidence, truths that had been suppressed, the letters Julian had sent to Elena that never received a response. She carried the confession of the former accountant, the proof that Julian had been a victim of a conspiracy to expel him from the company. And above all, she carried the determination to show that she didn't see him as just another homeless man, but as a human being, her grandfather, a dignified man whose honor had been trampled. Almost at noon, the faint creak of the door signaled that someone was entering. Jenna looked up and saw him. Julian, with his weary steps, worn coat, and face marked by deep wrinkles. His gaze swept the room with his usual caution. When his eyes settled on Jenna, she slowly stood up. She noticed how the old man frowned distrustfully. She had seen him before, trying to approach with empty words. He hadn't forgotten the sarcasm she had spat at his worn shoes that night, nor did he trust sudden gestures of repentance. Jenna moved slowly, with her palms visible, like someone approaching a wounded animal without wanting to scare it. She spoke in a low voice, trying not to disturb the few readers concentrated on their books. "Grandfather? Julian?" She didn't know exactly how to call him, if she had the right to that word denoting family closeness. "Please, I need you to see this." Julian looked at her coldly, without moving, without inviting her to sit. Jenna understood that each step would require titanic effort. She didn't blame him. She hated herself for having humiliated him. Without saying anything more, she opened the briefcase and took out the folder. She placed it on a nearby table and took a step back to avoid invading his space. "I've brought documents," she explained, trying to sound serene. "These are proofs showing what truly happened. Here are copies of the altered papers, the confession of an accountant who participated in the deceit, and," she swallowed, feeling a knot in her throat, "and also the letters you sent to my mother, Elena, over all these years. Letters we never knew how to respond to. Letters we should never have ignored." She said the last words with a broken voice. Julian hesitated, his stern gaze crossed with the folder, then with Jenna's eyes, and then returned to the folder. It was clear he didn't expect anything useful from her, but curiosity and resentment mixed inside him. Finally, he reached out his trembling hand, took the first document, and began to read in silence. Jenna did not sit beside him. She maintained a respectful distance, watching as the old man turned the pages slowly. She recognized the forged signatures, the tampered numbers, the strange manipulation that had once destroyed Julian's reputation. He frowned upon seeing his own initials incriminated in false reports, small details that had been enough to blame him for a non-existent embezzlement. An embezzlement that was the excuse to separate him from the company he had helped found. Julian held his breath several times, as if diving into a sea of painful memories. When he took one of the letters, he recognized his own handwriting, that calligraphy he had used to beg for years for a response from his daughter. His eyes welled up as he read his own words, in which he desperately asked for a minimum gesture of affection, a meeting, a message. Jenna felt her heart break upon seeing his pain. For the first time, he had before him the confirmation of what he had always suspected. He wasn't crazy. He hadn't misinterpreted things. They had silenced and abandoned him on purpose. Minutes passed without words. The occasional murmur of a reader flipping pages was the only sound in the library. Jenna discreetly wiped her tears, understanding that she couldn't force immediate forgiveness. What Julian was processing wasn't insignificant. It was a whole life of humiliation confirmed in paper and ink. When he looked up, his tear-filled eyes locked onto his granddaughter's. He didn't speak with anger, but with exhaustion. "Your mother, Eleanor. When she was a child, she liked to run through the garden of our old house. I taught her to tie her shoes, to climb a swing. Did you know that, Jenna?" The question disoriented the young woman. Julian wasn't talking about betrayal or evidence, but about memories of his daughter, of lost innocence. Jenna shook her head, unable to articulate a word. That was a fragment of the family life she never knew, a piece of history ripped from her memory by force of lies. Elena had a contagious laugh, Julian continued with a hoarse voice, and when she hurt her knee, she would run to me. She'd say, "Dad, it hurts," and I'd put a bandage on it and assure her that everything would be all right. When did we stop being all right? When did the family decide that I no longer belonged? The old man didn't expect a response. It was more a lament, the confirmation that the cheerful girl had become an adult who kept silent. Jenna noticed that he wasn't softening completely, that the pain didn't disappear with a couple of papers. It would be naive to believe that showing evidence could erase decades of neglect. But at least Julian was speaking, remembering, sharing small pieces of his past, looking her in the eye without calling her a liar or mocking her. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, grandfather," Jenna said softly. "I know what we did is unforgivable. I'm here to tell you that I don't want to be part of that silence. I know it's late, far too late, but I'm willing to make the truth known. I want your name cleared. I want people to know what they did to you. And I want you to know that I will never leave you alone again, or ignore you." Julian lowered his gaze, brushing the papers with his gnarled fingers. He didn't show immediate tenderness. He didn't hug her. He didn't say, "I forgive you." But he didn't push her away either, or shout at her. His breathing was heavy, as if he were fighting an internal battle against bitterness. After a long minute, he spoke cautiously. "We'll see if you do what you say. I don't need luxury nor charity. I just want the truth to exist, for me not to be erased from history, for what they did to be recognized. If you really care, use your influence for justice, not for cover-ups." Jenna nodded firmly. She felt a strange relief, a small victory amid the immense pain. At least Julian was willing to talk, to listen, to offer a minimal chance to make things right. She knew the road ahead would be long. She would have to face her father, the company, the public image. But now she had a roadmap. Defend Julian's name to the world, restore his dignity, and over time, perhaps he would find a spark of compassion for those who had betrayed him. "Thank you for listening to me," Jenna said, her eyes bright. Julian didn't respond with words. He simply closed the folder carefully, as if cherishing the documents. Jenna interpreted this as silent acceptance, a minimal, opening towards the future. It wasn't a happy ending or an automatic forgiveness, but it was the beginning of something different. A second chance to recover some of what had been lost among so many lies. As she left the library, the afternoon breeze felt cooler. Her steps were light, despite the moral burden she carried. She felt relieved in part because she had taken the first step. She had shown Julian the evidence, and this time he hadn't outright rejected her. There was still a world of work ahead, exposing the traps, demanding public apologies, fair compensation, moral restitutions. But she was no longer paralyzed by guilt, but driven by the will to do what was right. The bridge between the past and the present wasn't complete, but the first pillar had been laid. And for the first time, Jenna felt that her life had a purpose beyond triviality, to fight for her grandfather's truth, and with that, perhaps, to save her own humanity. The morning light filtered through the curtains in George's office, casting clear lines on the wooden floor. It was an impeccable place, carefully decorated to exude power and respect. Framed family portraits, diplomas with honorary titles, marble statuettes, framed contracts with strategic alliances. Everything there was meant to shout to the world that George was a successful man, reliable, a pillar of society. However, the air was thick with tension, even before Jenna crossed the door. Jenna arrived with the folder of documents pressed tightly against her chest, her pulse racing. She had mentally rehearsed this confrontation dozens of times. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Her father, until now, had been a figure who exercised control effortlessly. He made the rules, imposed silences, and she obeyed. But today, the story would be different. With her chin held high, she entered without asking for permission. George glanced up from some papers, a sales report, a new contract, who knew, and furrowed his brows. Seeing her with that different air, he understood that something had changed in his daughter. That young woman, once preoccupied only with her appearance and social acceptance, now seemed filled with a strange determination. There was a fire in her eyes, a strength he hadn't seen in her before. "Jenna," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and impatience. "I'm busy. Can you come back later?" She closed the door behind her, still holding the folder. She stepped forward, fixing her gaze on her father, noticing the subtle wrinkles on his forehead, the rigidity in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. He, too, was tense, though he wouldn't admit it. "No, Dad," she replied firmly. "I can't come back later. We need to talk now." George raised his eyebrows. He wasn't used to that tone from his daughter. He was accustomed to giving subtle orders, seeing her nod automatically or change the subject to avoid conflict. This time, there was no softness or evasion in her voice, just undeniable firmness. Jenna walked up to the desk and, without asking for permission, placed the folder on the polished surface. George watched her warily. He could guess what this was about. He wasn't a fool. The rumors about Julian and his daughter's questions had reached him. He had tried to ignore them, downplay them, but now he couldn't. "I've talked to Julian," Jenna began, noticing the subtle tremor in her father's gaze at the mention of the forbidden name. "I know what happened in the past. I know how they tricked him, how they altered documents to falsely accuse him of embezzlement. I know how they expelled him from the company, how they turned him into an outcast with no home, while the family rose in social prestige." George slowly stood from his chair, trying to maintain composure. He placed his hands on the desk, leaning forward, trying to intimidate her with his height, with his presence. But Jenna didn't back down an inch. "Where did you get these crazy ideas?" he muttered, his voice thick with venom. "Have you gone mad, Jenna? That's all in the past, and it's not like you think. You've been listening to rumors." "They're not rumors," Jenna interrupted, raising the folder and opening it to show him some of the pages. "I have the evidence, documents, confessions, the letters Julian sent over the years that were ignored. There are witnesses, Jacob, Olivia. There's a journalist, Matthew, who already has copies of these papers. Do you want to deny all of this in front of the evidence?" George paled slightly. His right hand clenched on the surface of the desk. He never thought his daughter would go this far. He tried to adjust himself, maintain control. "Jenna, this cannot come to light. Do you understand what you're asking? Do you want to ruin your own family, destroy everything we've built? This company is your inheritance. Do you intend to demolish our prestige, humiliate your father, tarnish the name that has given you a life of luxury and privilege? George's voice rose, sharp with contained rage. He could feel the seat of power wobbling under his weight. His daughter was now an internal threat, an unpredictable factor. Once so malleable, now she seemed made of granite. Jenna took a deep breath, forcing herself not to lower her gaze before her father's fury. Her heart was racing, but she didn't hesitate. The family is already morally ruined, Dad. What prestige are you talking about? It was built on the humiliation of an honest man. I don't want these lies. I don't want this wealth stained with cruelty. I want you to publicly acknowledge what they did to Julian, that compensation is offered to the employees who were harmed, that an apology is made to the man they destroyed. George clenched his teeth. For him, giving in to that request was unthinkable. Admitting mistakes, exposing the internal dirt, would dismantle the facade he had worked so hard to build. He blinked with rage. Do you want to ruin your family's reputation before the world? For what? To please an old man who couldn't adapt, who insisted on blocking our progress with outdated ideas? That company wouldn't have gotten as far with him in charge. He only slowed our growth. Jenna raised a finger, demanding silence. She felt a surge of indignation, but she held back the urge to shout. Now she had clarity in her words. Julian didn't block progress. He defended justice. Human values are not an obstacle, Dad. They are what give dignity to success. You chose to crush him to grow faster. And I participated in that silence, unknowingly. Now that I know the truth, I won't stay quiet. George straightened up, trying to regain composure. His eyes burned with rage, but also with disbelief. When had his daughter changed so much? When had childish arrogance given way to a moral consciousness capable of challenging him? You're naive, he spat. The world doesn't reward weakness. If we open this Pandora's box, we'll all be harmed. You'll lose your inheritance, your position, the comfort you're used to. Are you willing to lose everything for an old man you've never seen in your life? Jenna's face hardened. She placed the folder on the desk with a firm gesture. Yes, she replied without hesitation. I'm willing to lose everything, because I can't live with this guilt anymore. I'd rather have a clear conscience and face the consequences than keep up this farce. Julian deserves to be vindicated, and you. No, I'm right. He's not just an old man. He's my grandfather. He's your father-in-law. He's part of this family you betrayed. George pressed his lips together until they formed a thin line. He knew Jenna had the evidence. He knew there was a journalist with copies of the documents. Time was running out. He couldn't contain the truth with bribes or veiled threats without raising suspicions. And now his daughter was demanding a public act of contrition that his pride would not allow him to even imagine. This is madness, he murmured, trying not to shout. You're condemning your own family. You'll have enemies. The press will devour us. Partners will turn away. And for what? Jenna straightened even further, drawing strength from the newly discovered certainties. What for? So that the truth prevails. So that my grandfather knows that not everyone in this family is complicit in the deception. So that the victims receive some form of redress. And so that, finally, I can sleep without feeling disgusted with myself. A cold fury gleamed in George's eyes. Until now, he had always dominated the situation. His word was law. But before him stood a daughter he didn't recognize, more mature, braver, more human. He saw her so determined that he didn't know how to bring her down without exposing himself. He could shout, threaten to disinherit her, isolate her, ridicule her in public. But would it do any good? She had stopped fearing him, and that terrified him. A tense silence stretched on for several seconds. The faint ticking of a clock on the wall could be heard. Jenna kept her gaze steady, waiting for a response. George, unable to relent, responded with silence and hatred contained in his expression. You've chosen a dangerous path, he finally said, his voice low. "Don't expect mercy when things get tough." Jenna felt a chill, but she didn't allow herself to be intimidated. She grabbed the folder without breaking eye contact with her father. "Mercy is owed to Julian, not to me," she answered calmly. Then she turned and left the office, leaving behind the acrid scent of a confrontation that marked a before and after in her life, in the family, and in the company's history. As she closed the door, she knew the war had been declared. Truth against lies, dignity against greed, moral courage against the fear of losing it all. No one could escape the consequences anymore. The bubble was about to burst, and for the first time, Jenna didn't fear the explosion. The night cloaked the city in its grey mantle, and inside Sydney's apartment, a deceptive calm reigned. Only a few hours earlier, the lawyer had left the company's offices with her usual steady pace, neutral expression, and folder of documents under her arm, just as she did every day. Those who saw her leave suspected nothing unusual, for Sydney was known for her efficiency, her silence, her unwavering loyalty to the family and its interests. Now, back in the solitude of her home, the story was different. On the dark wood desk, perfectly arranged, lay several yellowed documents, papers stamped with seals from decades past, and internal correspondence that should never have seen the light of day. They were the same proofs she had been avoiding, the same trail that, by not asking questions, she had preferred not to follow. Until that day, Sydney had always justified her passivity with the belief that this was how the business world worked. Shortcuts were taken, figures were adjusted, and silence was negotiated. Success, she had been taught, wasn't always transparent. As a lawyer, her role was to make sure nothing illegal came to light. But now, after the recent tensions, revelations, and Matthew's investigations, things had changed. Sydney knew more than she would have liked. The documents before her left no room for doubt. The family had exiled Julian, one of its founders, building its empire on betrayal. It was more than mere accounting irregularities. It was a moral crime, the deliberate destruction of a man's reputation and life. Outside, fine rain began to fall gently, tapping against the window with a constant murmur. The sound of water against glass made her feel a sense of isolation. In that small space of her home, with no witnesses or masks, Sydney felt vulnerable, cornered by her own conscience. She sat in a high-backed armchair, one she had chosen for its elegance and comfort. The grey linen upholstery was as sober as her wardrobe and her way of presenting herself to the world. She stared at the papers, internal letters showing the conspiracy against Julian, covert orders to pressure witnesses, redirect funds, manipulate balances. In her career, she had seen murky maneuvers, shadowy negotiations, but never something so blatant and cruel. She had unwittingly become complicit in the most absolute injustice. Her job had been to hide the traces, to legally shelter the decisions that had ruined an innocent man. As her fingers traced the spine of a folder, a sharp pang of anguish pierced her. If she now decided to act ethically and expose the truth, what would happen to her career, to her reputation? The family considered her a valuable piece, a guardian of its impeccable facade. If she broke loyalty, she could lose everything. She would be marked as a traitor lawyer, an innocent who didn't know how to play the power game. Other colleagues would lose respect for her, seeing her as irresponsible, someone who bit the hand that fed her. And then there were the direct repercussions to fear. How many secrets did the family hold? How many strings could they pull to isolate her, smear her, or worse? This wasn't a simple intrigue film. It was real life, and she knew it. However, the price of silence was also very high. Every time she looked in the mirror, she knew her silence prolonged the shame, the pain, the injustice. It was as if an invisible stain was spreading over her name, dirtying the degree she had worked so hard to earn, tainting the vocation she had once sworn to use to defend justice. Sydney remembered her student years, the passion with which she had studied law, the idealism with which she believed laws were a tool to build a fairer world. When had she lost her way? When did she decide that discretion and the profitability of silence were worth more than the truth? The rain now beat more intensely against the windows. The city outside carried on, unaware of the moral storm that was shaking the lawyer. Sydney stood and walked to the bathroom. She needed to splash her face with cold water, to feel it against her skin. There, in front of the mirror, she looked at her reflection. She saw her face, usually serene, now marked by dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the shadow of regret in her gaze. "Who are you, Sydney?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. She didn't see the impeccable, confident professional who, in elegant suits, walked firmly into the company's offices. She saw a woman tired of hiding the truth, stunned by the weight of the secrets she had helped preserve. A knot formed in her throat. She tried to imagine Julian's face, the sadness reflected in his eyes when he found out everything the family had denied him, the suffering of other employees hurt by unfair decisions. Wasn't it her moral duty to denounce it, to expose it all, to clear up some of the muck covering that story? Her hands trembled as she turned on the tap. The cold water ran over her fingers, and when she brought a wet hand to her face, she felt a shiver. She could no longer deceive herself. It wasn't just a question of conscience, it was a question of identity. Did she want to be the mercenary lawyer, willing to stay silent for a paycheck and a comfortable status? Or the brave woman who accepted the consequences of defending the truth, even if the truth was uncomfortable, dangerous, and costly? The mirror returned a gaze full of questions. Sydney remembered the events of the last few weeks, Jenna's insistence, Matthew's determination, the desperate confessions of former employees, and Julian's reappearance. Every new element was a hammer against the family's honor facade. The house of cards was about to fall, and she could choose whether to prop it up with more lies or help bring it down. The voice of conscience, so muffled in the past, was beginning to grow clearer. Sydney understood that justice was not an abstract concept, but a principle that should guide her actions. Breaking loyalty meant betraying those who had hired her, yes, but it would also allow her to reclaim her dignity. She might lose her job, her circle of influence, maybe even her financial security. But in exchange, she would regain honesty. She could look at herself in the mirror without shame. She turned off the tap and dried her hands with a white towel. Through the bathroom window, the rain kept falling, insistent. She returned to her desk, sat down, and once again stared at the documents. They told the hidden story of a man dragged into misery by those who were supposed to be his family. Sydney swallowed hard, her heart beating strongly. She knew she wouldn't make a final decision that night. It was too much. But she had already taken the first step, acknowledging the problem, knowing that if she stayed silent, she could no longer claim ignorance or neutrality. She could inform Matthew of what she knew, provide evidence, give a confidential testimony that would help expose the internal corruption. She could contribute to a reparative act, though late for Julian and the victims. She could finally stand on the right side of history. She stood again and turned off the desk lamp. The darkness of the room surrounded her, but in her mind, one thought glowed. True loyalty was not to those who paid her salary, but to the justice her profession demanded she defend. In front of the mirror, Sydney had faced her own reflection, seen her exhaustion and her regret. Now she knew she had to answer the question that burned in her chest. How could she, from now on, live with herself if she didn't do the right thing? The night wore on. The rain continued. The city slept unaware of the moral dilemma keeping the lawyer awake. But within her, something was beginning to change. The seed of righteousness, long smothered, was sprouting again. And even though the path to the truth would be steep, Sydney was preparing to take the first step, though she still didn't know exactly when or how. What mattered was that, in front of the mirror, she no longer saw herself as a silent accomplice, but as a woman about to reclaim her own conscience. The morning Sydney chose to act dawned with a shy sun, barely managing to pierce a soft mist. From her window, the lawyer observed the hustle of the city, cars speeding, people in coats hurrying to their jobs, messengers on bikes zigzagging through the asphalt. It was the same routine as always, the mundane and predictable order that repeated itself day after day, oblivious to the moral dramas occupying her mind. But for Sydney, that morning was no longer just another one. Her life was about to take a sharp turn. After dressing in simple clothes, very different from her usual elegant outfits, she reviewed the folder she had prepared the night before. Inside rested copies of internal documents, altered accounting reports, private letters, and incriminating memoranda. Those papers were the living proof of the betrayal against Julian, the dirty foundation upon which the business empire had been built. She gently caressed the pages with trembling hands. She had never felt so much fear, yet at the same time, so much determination. She was saying goodbye to her role as a passive observer and unwitting accomplice. She was saying hello to a new version of herself, one that didn't know her ending. She made several hesitant calls, speaking with Matthew, the journalist who had been digging in the shadows for the truth about Julian. The man, surprised that the lawyer had dared to contact him, suggested a discreet meeting place, not an elegant restaurant or a central cafe where they could be seen, but a modest establishment in a residential neighborhood, with a few tables and barely a couple of windows, far from prying eyes. It was the kind of place where one blended with common folk, where conversations were lost in the everyday murmur. Sydney's heart raced as she entered the cafe. It was a small place with wooden chairs and a display case showing simple pastries. The aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the air. Matthew was sitting by a wall with a worn mural, pretending to read a newspaper. When he saw her, he gave her a small, discreet smile. She walked over, sat down, and placed the folder on the table carefully. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, leaning toward her. His dark, alert eyes reflected both disbelief and the gravity of the moment. Sydney swallowed before nodding. Her hands were sweating, her knees slightly shaky. "I can't stay silent anymore," she said in a hushed voice. "These documents prove the conspiracy. Julian was unjustly expelled. They altered the books, manipulated the balances, pressured the accountant Lucio, silenced others. Here are the names, dates, amounts, everything." Matthew held his breath as he opened the folder. His eyes devoured the pages eagerly, his pen moving quickly across the notebook where he jotted down marginal notes. It was more than he had ever dreamed of finding, a perfect link that connected suspicions with concrete evidence. As he flipped through the pages, the journalist realized this wasn't a vague or exaggerated story, but a well-documented reality. "This is incredible," he whispered, unable to hide his excitement. "This is the missing link. With this, we can prove that Julian wasn't a ghost or a petty obstacle, but a betrayed founder. We can expose the shady origin of part of their fortune. This is going to be a scandal." Sydney felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew her actions would come at a cost. She could lose the family's support, lose her job, see her reputation as a corporate lawyer ruined. Many colleagues would wonder why she broke the loyalty. They'd label her an idealist or a traitor. But wasn't it worse to live with the weight of complicity? She thought of Julian, a man forced to wander the streets while his name was erased from history, while the family flaunted philanthropy and luxury. She thought of Jenna's pain, of the moral awakening the young woman had gone through. She thought of the words exchanged between Matthew and herself the night before, how justice wasn't a mere decoration, but a necessity. "Publish it all," she finally whispered, her voice firm. "The world must know the truth." Matthew looked at her with respect. He understood the sacrifice she was making. It was rare for someone from the inside to dare to break the chain of silence. He extended his hand and gently placed it on Sydney's. "I'll do what's right," he promised. "But you need to know this will draw attention to you. George and the others won't stand by idly." Sydney nodded. Her gaze hardened. She was aware of the risks, but she wouldn't back down. Her conscience, stronger than fear, pushed her forward. Though the uncertainty was suffocating, the idea of washing her hands and doing nothing had become unbearable. "I'll face the consequences," she said, withdrawing her hand to grasp the coffee cup. "There's a limit to what I can justify. I'm not a pawn without will. I want to believe my profession can serve justice, not just convenience." As Sydney and Matthew exchanged a few final words several blocks away, George felt increasingly cornered. He had received an anonymous message suggesting documents had been leaked to the press. Tensions within the company were palpable. He ordered an investigation into the system, reviewing who had accessed old files, discreetly questioning suspicious employees. But the clues were slippery. He made calls from his office, demanded reports, and pressured his trusted people. No one could find the culprit. Was it an internal mole? Had Jenna convinced someone? Or was it the journalist who had played dirty? The conjectures made his head spin. He felt his empire trembling, cracks appearing that couldn't be hidden with charitable donations or lavish events. The facade was breaking, and the creaking was incessant. Meanwhile, in the cafe, Sydney and Matthew parted with a silent handshake, no witnesses. He carefully tucked the folder under his coat, aware of the treasure he was guarding. Sydney left first, blending in with the people on the sidewalk. Her gaze swept the street with a touch of paranoia, fearing she was being followed. But no one seemed to be watching her, at least not visibly. The freedom of that step felt strangely sweet and bitter at once. For his part, Matthew hurried toward his office, knowing the hours ahead would be filled with intense work. He had meticulous verification of the information to do, the writing of the report, and coordination with his outlet to launch the bombshell. He knew that once it was published, nothing would ever be the same. George, in his office, felt a pressure in his chest that afternoon. Anxiety consumed him. His internal investigations were yielding nothing. No one confessed. No one left traces. Every passing minute felt like another nail in the coffin of the family's reputation. The sands of the hourglass were running. The countdown to the scandal was advancing, and he was stranded without a clear plan. How long would it take for the truth to explode? As the day declined, Sydney returned home without the folder, but with a strange lightness in her chest. She made herself tea, sat by the window, and watched the sky turn orange at sunset. A day ago, she had been a woman trapped in her moral dilemmas, staring at her reflection in the mirror with shame. Now, though the future looked uncertain, she had chosen ethics over silence. With that gesture, she had lit a fuse no one could easily extinguish. The truth, now freed, would race through the streets, reaching readers, television viewers, and radio listeners. It would echo in forums, social media, political debates, and family gatherings. And whatever happened, Sydney knew she had taken the right step. In a society where silence often buys comfort, she had dared to break the chain. And that day, marked by the trembling of her hands and the courage of her decision, would be etched as the moment when justice found a new ally. The next morning, an unusual commotion began to stir the sidewalks in front of the imposing headquarters of the family business. The building, usually surrounded by luxury cars, impeccably dressed managers, and hurried secretaries, now faced a different reality. A small group of people initially gathered with handmade signs, painted cardboard, and enlarged photographs. Each person had their own story, a silenced grievance, an ignored injustice, and now they had decided to make their voices heard. Jacob and Olivia were the heart of the protest. The two, with weathered hands and the wrinkles of hard work etched into their faces, stood at the front. Their signs, though simple, drew attention. "Justice for Julian" was written in bold letters, and alongside that phrase, a black and white portrait of Julian, younger, smiling among papers and machines from the company he had helped create. Other signs demanded compensation for wrongful dismissals, decent working conditions, and recognition for those erased from the family's history. Soon, more people joined. Former employees unjustly expelled, neighbors affected by forced evictions when the company needed to expand its facilities, and family members of workers who had suffered abuses. Students, curious onlookers, and labor rights defenders also arrived. The crowd grew, and the air was filled with demands that had once floated in silence. Jenna approached with tense steps, accompanied by Clara and Sarah. It was the first time Jenna exposed herself in this way. Her clothing was no longer from elegant parties, but simple clothes without class markers. Clara looked at her with a serious smile, approving her decision. Sarah, with her firm demeanor, had insisted it was time to join, to stand with those who had been ignored. Until that moment, Jenna had never felt the pulse of the street, the vital force of a crowd raising their voices, demanding what was right without protocols or labels. For Jenna, each step toward the crowd was a landing in the real world. She was no longer in the mansion's bubble, nor in a gala hall surrounded by fake smiles. Now she was walking on the same sidewalk as the oppressed. She was aware of the gaze of others. Some would recognize her as George's daughter, Julian's granddaughter. They might judge her, but she was there to prove that she was capable of feeling shame, remorse, and, above all, a desire for change. Meanwhile, Eleanor appeared with a pale face and lowered eyes. Her hands trembled, perhaps from fear of being seen, of being judged by the neighbors, or the press that would soon arrive alerted by the rumors of the protest. But a moral force pushed her to be there. Perhaps her presence wouldn't mend years of silence, but at least she wouldn't continue ignoring the suffering caused. When Jenna saw her, she walked over silently. Mother and daughter exchanged a look full of sorrow, a mutual recognition of the harm and the need to finally face it. Among the crowd, one of the signs displayed Julian's name in bold, dark strokes, surrounded by a red circle, as if it were a rising sun after decades of silence. Slogans were shouted, "Recognize Julian! No more lies! Justice for the workers!" The chorus of voices grew with each passing minute, and the police, stationed a few meters away, watched with expectant attitudes. There was no chaos, just contained indignation and a fervor born from the need to be heard. Some passers-by stopped, incredulous. They knew the company's name as synonymous with prestige, ostentatious philanthropy, and supposed social responsibility. To see it now besieged by demands pointed to a crack in that perfect image. Little by little, television cameras appeared. Reporters mingled with the people, curious about the story behind the signs. The news of the conspiracy, the betrayal of Julian and so many others, had already begun to filter through social media and alternative media. It was only a matter of time before it exploded in the major news outlets. Jenna, with her heart in her throat, positioned herself near Jacob and Olivia. Clara held her arm, offering encouragement. Sarah, with a firm look, smiled to the side. It was symbolic. The granddaughter of the man erased from history now stood with the workers, with the displaced, recognizing that her family had been complicit in their oppression. From time to time, Jenna lifted her gaze toward the reflective windows of the building. She imagined her father, George, or Baron, the partner, watching from above with fury or fear. She imagined the trembling hands of those who thought the past would never come back to demand the price of their injustice. Now, the streets were an open tribunal, and the people, with their signs, their anger, and their dignity, demanded answers. Elena, a few steps away, pressed her hands to her chest. She could feel the inquisitive stares of some of the protesters. What was she doing there? Didn't she belong to the guilty family? But she also realized that her presence, however insignificant it seemed, was a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Thus, with her voice subdued but present, Jenna's mother understood that there would be no way to hide behind the mansion's walls. The reality had to be faced. The police kept their distance. No one wanted a crackdown that would only escalate the scandal. The officers seemed as surprised as the passers-by. The voices in the street multiplied, growing firmer, more urgent. Some, with improvised microphones, shared personal stories. The day a foreman humiliated them, the time a severance payment was denied, the rumor that Julian was expelled without evidence. Each testimony added fuel to the fire of indignation. Jenna took a deep breath. She sensed a different aroma in the air, not just the smog and the crowd, but the scent of truth beginning to emerge from the cracks of a shattered facade. The chorus of voices was a raw chant, unembellished, demanding justice with simple and forceful language. Nothing like the diplomatic speeches at galas or the philanthropic promises written in sophisticated press releases. Here, the demand was direct. That the company recognize Julian, that they repair the damage, that they put an end to the hypocrisy. As the cameras rolled, Clara leaned toward Jenna and whispered, "This won't be easy. Your father is going to resist." Jenna nodded, pressing her lips together. She knew it, but she had come too far to turn back now. For the first time, she was certain she was on the right side. And although it hurt to recognize the sinister role her family had played, she also felt a new strength, the certainty that to build something better, they had to break the silence. They had to unearth the truth and shout it in the middle of the street for everyone to see. Sarah, with her clear voice, began to lead a chant that the crowd followed. It was a concise demand, with no frills. Jenna and Elena joined in the murmur, overcoming their shyness. The crowd, strengthened by every added voice, formed a collective roar that made the company behind its glass walls nervous. There, in the street, the air felt dense but true. The air of justice demanding its turn, the air of dignity shaking off the dust after years of silence. The tension increased with every passing second. The sun shone on the signs that demanded recognition for Julian, on the photographs of forgotten workers, on the tense faces of Jenna, Clara, Sarah, Jacob, Olivia, and so many others. It was the prelude to an inevitable outcome. The truth had come to the streets, and no one could push it back into the darkness. The climate in the city was suffocating. While the protest continued to burn in front of the company headquarters, George and Baron understood that they could no longer ignore the pressure. The cries in the streets, the signs bearing Julian's name, the incisive questions from the press that multiplied each day, everything pushed them to act. That's why, that morning, they called a press conference in a last-minute rented hall, a neutral space where, in theory, they could control the narrative. The press room was large, with an elevated podium and a long table covered by an immaculate white cloth. The rows of chairs were almost filled with journalists and cameramen seeking the exclusive. The flashes pointed expectantly at the empty stage. Just seconds before the start, the whispers of conversations were tense, laden with doubt. Everyone knew about the growing scandal and awaited the moment when the lies would crumble or, conversely, when the family would try to squirm out with hollow promises. Matthew, the journalist who had gathered the concrete evidence, was seated in the last rows. He dressed simply, almost anonymously, and his notebook rested on his lap. Inside his briefcase were copies of the documents provided by Sydney and the statements he had obtained from Lucio and other witnesses. His gaze moved nervously around the room, scanning the anxious faces, anticipating the clash that was about to unfold. He knew that George and Baron would try a desperate maneuver, charitable promises, announcements of scholarships, $1 million, donations to NGOs, anything to divert attention from the betrayal of Julian and the mistreatment of their former employees. Sydney, blending in among the attendees, had arrived unnoticed. Her heart was pounding. It was the first time she had seen so closely the consequences of her leak. She was the one who had given Matthew the fateful evidence, and now she was there, an unwilling witness to the outcome. Would they recognize her? Would she be pointed out as the internal traitor? She feared the repercussions, but she knew her place was among the people, not behind the curtain of deception. The room lighting became more intense when George and Baron entered, accompanied by their public relations team. George wore a dark suit, his tie perfectly tied, and an expression of stiffness. Baron, beside him, tried to smile, but the grimace on his lips was forced, almost a sneer. They sat down behind the table, adjusting papers and documents with slightly trembling hands. The flashes erupted. Murmurs, camera clicks, the hum of microphones capturing every breath. "Welcome," George began in a deep voice. "Thank you for attending this extraordinary press conference. We have called the media to announce a series of philanthropic initiatives that our family and company intend to contribute to social welfare." The words floated in the air like soap bubbles, bright, hollow, destined to burst. George held up a document in front of the cameras. It talked about a new community center, scholarships for education, a half-promised hospital. Baron added in a soft tone that they would invest funds in projects for disadvantaged youth. It was the classic strategy, a flashy move, a display of feigned generosity meant to shine the spotlight elsewhere. In the front rows, some journalists exchanged skeptical looks. They knew there was a darker story behind these sudden donations. Matthew, from his seat, gripped his pen tightly. He was waiting for the right moment to speak up and ask the uncomfortable questions that would shatter the facade. Meanwhile, Jenna, who had not been officially invited to the press conference, managed to slip in with Clara and Sarah's help. They hid at the back of the room, near a side door, observing the scene from the rear. Jenna's heart was tight, knowing her father would try to keep lying, and that she was now part of the group determined to expose him. She had sent Julian a message, warning him about the event. She didn't know if he would come, but she felt he deserved to witness the spectacle of hypocrisy. She needed him to know that his granddaughter would not side with the falsehood. At the entrance of the room, without drawing attention, Julian appeared. He wore his worn coat, his grey hair disheveled, and stood at the side, not getting too close. He watched the table on the stage with a mixture of fury and sadness. There were his son-in-law, George, and his partner, Baron, acting as benevolent philanthropists. No one was asking about the fraud, the ignored letters, the ruined lives. At least, not yet. Julian suppressed a growl. He had come to witness how they tried to wash their dirty hands with flashy checks. Would he witness their downfall? The tension rose another level when, after the bright promises, a journalist raised her hand and asked firmly, "Mr. George, your company faces growing accusations of marginalizing and deceiving one of its founders, Julian, as well as firing employees unjustly. Can you respond to these allegations before talking about new projects?" The silence thickened. George frowned. Baron cleared his throat. They hadn't expected the first question to be so direct. They tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. "We've always supported the community," said George. "Those stories are malicious rumors. We are here today to present concrete facts. A multi-million-dollar donation to the Children's Hospital, a scholarship program for underprivileged youth." But the questions multiplied. Another journalist stood up. "Why then are there protesters in the street demanding justice for Julian? Why do so many employees say the company built its fortune on lies?" Matthew stood up. The room tensed. Everyone knew Matthew was an incisive journalist, and he had been investigating the case for a long time. He raised his voice carefully. "Mr. George, Mr. Baron, I have in my possession documents proving accounting alterations and ignored letters from Julian. Do you deny the authenticity of these documents? Will you continue to uphold your version?" The room erupted in murmurs. Sydney shifted in her seat, her heart in her throat, aware that those papers were likely the ones she had leaked. George clenched his jaw, searching for Baron with his eyes, who was now sweating under the spotlight. "This is a falsehood," Baron managed to say, his voice slightly broken. "We don't know what documents you're talking about. Our company has always been transparent." Jenna, from the back, could not hold back a tremble in her hands. Clara whispered for her to hold on, that there was no turning back now. The truth was beginning to scratch the surface of that flawless facade. Julian, standing by the door, felt his eyes mist up with contained rage. There they were, denying everything once again, pretending not to know the evidence. But this time, they weren't going to get away with it. He looked at Matthew, the journalist, and the sea of lenses now trained on the two men on stage. The trick of the new donations wasn't fooling anyone. The public was no longer satisfied with empty promises. The pressure increased when another journalist shouted without waiting for a turn. "Is it true that Julian was one of the founders? Why was he accused of embezzlement? Can the company show transparent records from that time?" George wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He used to control the situation with a snap of his fingers, but now thousands of eyes were scrutinizing every gesture. He tried to remain calm. "This company has always followed the law. We won't respond to lies, and today we want to focus on our social commitment." The phrase didn't convince anyone. Matthew insisted. "Do you call lies the ignored letters, the testimonies from former employees, the confession from the accountant Lucio? I have copies right here." And then, amidst the crowd, a fragile, tired but firm voice broke through the air. Julian stepped forward, uncaring that he hadn't been invited. Some murmured his name in awe. The elderly man they had seen in photos, now in the flesh, was attending the farce. He cleared his throat. "My name is Julian," he said, and the silence was total. "I co-founded this company. For years I sent letters begging to be heard. Will you call me a liar to my face?" The room seemed to freeze. The cameras turned toward him, lighting up the wrinkles on his face, his modest clothing, and the trembling of his hands. George and Baron turned pale. A murmur grew, with reporters raising their microphones, eager to capture every word from the elderly man. Jenna felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her grandfather had come, defiant, to witness his own vindication. Sydney closed her eyes for a second, relieved, knowing her decision had helped bring them to this point. Matthew pressed his lips together, aware that the crucial moment had now arrived, right before the cameras. The donations, the flashy checks, and the promises of philanthropy were relegated to the background. The staged press conference had turned into a moral battleground, with Julian, the man erased from the past, claiming his place under the spotlight. George and Baron, trapped by the truth they could no longer escape, were forced to face the press, the witnesses, the history written in documents and letters. The tension was unbearable. No one knew how this would end, but it was clear that the masks had fallen. The countdown to the scandal had ended, and the truth, at last, was emerging for all to see. The tension in the room seemed on the verge of exploding. George and Baron, seated behind the main table, continued talking about their supposed philanthropic projects, pointing to colorful graphs on a giant screen and showing carefully selected photographs. New donations, innovative social programs, collaboration with recognized foundations, they repeated with tense smiles. Some reporters kept taking notes, while others openly displayed their skepticism. Too many unanswered questions hung in the air. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. A murmur, soft at first and then growing, spread through the rows of chairs. From the back entrance of the room, an elderly figure slowly advanced, supported by a carved cane. Hector, the great-uncle, made his entrance with fragile but determined bearing, pushing through curious attendees who made way for him, incredulous to see him there. His tired eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, were fixed with firm resolve on the podium where George and Baron were still speaking, unaware of his presence. Beside Hector, discreetly, were Elena and Jenna. Mother and daughter had supported his arrival, holding his arm with one hand to keep him steady among the crowd. The mere appearance of Hector, a forgotten and sidelined family member, piqued the curiosity of the audience. What was an elderly man who never appeared at family public events doing here? Why was he arriving at this delicate moment? The shock had not yet subsided when the door stirred again. This time, an even more unexpected figure entered. Julian. The elderly man erased from the family narrative, the one whose existence had been denied, the man turned into a myth, was now here in flesh and blood. His modest clothing contrasted with the luxury of the event. his worn shoes and somber gaze standing out amidst the sea of suits and ties. For many reporters, it was like the materialization of a legend, the forgotten co-founder, the ghost who had been a rumor for decades, suddenly appearing unannounced on the main stage. A muffled murmur turned into a wave of whispers. The cameras swung toward him in unison, the lenses focused eagerly on Julian. Some reporters tried to ask him questions, but the elderly man did not answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the front rows, making his way with the simple power of his presence. He had never needed to shout to make an impact. His mere appearance spoke louder than 1,000 words. George, realizing the commotion behind him, stopped his monologue. The forced smile disappeared from his face as he recognized Hector and, most importantly, Julian. His eyes gleamed with barely concealed panic. Baron also turned pale as the crowd moved chairs and camera tripods to make space for the newcomers. The press conference, carefully orchestrated to cleanse their image, had turned into an impromptu theater with actors who weren't invited to their own play. Jacob and Olivia, at the back of the room, exchanged a glance full of hope. They had been waiting for this moment for years, dreaming of the day Julian would reappear not as an invisible beggar, but as the honorable man he had been. Sarah and Clara, alongside Jenna, stayed close, ready to offer him moral support. The young heiress, Jenna, felt her heart beat hard. She had done everything she could to warn her grandfather, and now he was here, ready to face the truth, without intermediaries or masks. The atmosphere electrified. The flashes kept blinking non-stop, capturing every wrinkle on Julian's face, every tremor in Hector's hands, every drop of sweat on George and Baron's foreheads. Before the eyes of dozens of reporters and cameras, the family, the witnesses of the past, and Julian himself were all gathered on the same stage. It was a confrontation as inevitable as it was feared. Hector, his voice rough, addressed the room without needing a microphone. "This man," he said, gesturing toward Julian, "is the co-founder they dared to deny for decades. And I, Hector, can attest to that. The truth can no longer stay hidden." His voice, cracked with age, resonated with surprising clarity throughout the room. George swallowed, unable to respond immediately. Baron, tense, was desperately looking for a rhetorical escape. But Julian's physical presence shut down any argument based on denial. The elderly man was there. He wasn't a rumor, he wasn't a lie manufactured by the press. He was the real man, his history erased, claiming his identity under public scrutiny. Julian, his voice low but firm, added, "I was a co-founder. I was one of the ones who shaped this company. And they," he pointed with his chin at the table, "decided to erase me, accusing me of a crime I didn't commit. My name disappeared from the records. My letters were never answered. Now they try to present themselves as benefactors, forgetting the blood, sweat, and dignity they trampled on. I am here so they can no longer hide what they did." Julian's words were like an electric jolt that ran through the room. Some reporters stood up from their chairs, others began firing questions at point-blank range. Why did they erase him? What do you have to say about this, gentlemen? Will there be compensation? Will you publicly apologize? George tried to articulate a response, but the voices of the press drowned him out. Baron raised his hand, trying to calm the crowd, but his gesture was lost in a chaos of flashing lights and raised microphones. Jenna, witnessing this head-on clash, felt the scene was both terrible and necessary. There were the pieces of the past and the present. Elena bowing her head, aware of her silences. Hector, tired of staying silent. Jacob and Olivia, reclaiming the man who had defended them when they were workers. Sarah and Clara, firm in their support of the truth. And at the center of it all, Julian, recovering a piece of his dignity, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. The line of cameras aligned, capturing every reaction. The company, so confident in its prestige, was now facing scrutiny with no escape. The testimonies, the letters, the accusations, Sydney's papers handed to Matthew, all converged in that moment. The audience, the entire country that would watch this broadcast later, would have to ask themselves how many more Julians had been buried in oblivion by seemingly untouchable companies. No one knew how it would end, but it was clear that this day would be etched in collective memory. The farce of the press conference could no longer be upheld. George and Baron no longer controlled the narrative. Julian and Hector had turned the stage into a moral tribunal, with the press as the jury and the truth as the only witness. It was impossible to predict the outcome. Would they apologize? Deny the undeniable? Try to bribe public opinion with more promises? The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. Every second, every word, counted. Jenna, her hands intertwined, understood that there was no turning back. The silence pact had been broken, and now everyone involved in the family tragedy was face to face. The truth, at last, had a real chance of coming to light, and no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. The podium had turned into a moral battlefield. The graphs, the charitable promises, and the carefully prepared script by George and Baron no longer mattered. Under the harsh light of the cameras, the truth demanded its place with irresistible force. Matthew, the journalist, stood up determined, his voice firm like a hammer pounding through the silence. "Will you admit that Julian was a co-founder of this company?" he demanded, raising his voice enough to be heard above the murmurs. "Why did you falsely accuse him? What do you say to the evidence confirming internal corruption and document manipulation?" The entire room held its breath. George, standing behind the table, paled almost imperceptibly, but the cameras captured it with precision. Baron, standing beside him, sweated under the direct spotlight, his gaze frantically searching for an escape among the sea of eyes scrutinizing him. The murmur of the journalists turned into a buzz of questions, a deafening chorus demanding answers. Sydney, the lawyer, understood that the moment had come to put a face to her decision. Until then, hidden among the crowd, she stepped forward. She had taken off the cloak of anonymity that had protected her, risking everything. With a trembling but determined voice, she spoke. "I've reviewed the evidence," she said, lifting her chin, "and I can confirm its authenticity. The documents Mr. Matthew holds are real. I've seen the internal records, the letters that were never answered, the accounting manipulations that unjustly incriminated Julian." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. An internal company lawyer, who until now was assumed to be loyal to George and Baron, was confirming the worst. Journalists scribbled frantically, cameras captured every gesture, and social media buzzed with speculation. Jenna, near the entrance, felt the adrenaline course through her veins. Her gaze met Sydney's. Two women from different worlds, now united by the same will to expose the truth. Hector, the great-uncle, moved forward with slow steps, leaning on his cane. His hoarse and tired voice carried decades of silence. "I always knew," he admitted in a broken voice. Julian was an essential part of the beginning. His integrity was unquestionable. We all knew that. But they expelled him with lies, and I, out of fear of losing privileges, didn't defend him. Now I must admit it in front of everyone. It was an injustice. The old man lifted his gaze toward George, who was struggling to remain upright. His eyes welled with tears, but he did not retreat. The pressure was unbearable. Elena, standing next to Jenna, broke into tears. Her tears were of shame, remorse, and guilt. With a trembling voice, she said what she had kept silent for years. Letters came. Dozens of letters from Julian, my father. I kept them in a drawer without opening them, out of fear, out of convenience, out of cowardice. I never replied. I thought that by following the family's rules, I was protecting our reputation. Now I know I was feeding the lie. The cameras zoomed in on her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands clutching a crumpled handkerchief. The press captured every sob, every word filled with penitence. Jenna, with wet eyes, stepped forward. She knew she had to speak. Her voice came out broken, but clear. "Grandfather," she said, addressing Julian, I failed you too. I humiliated you in the street without knowing who you were, without caring about your story. I treated you like a worthless stranger. I was raised in a bubble where the truth didn't matter. I believed that status and wealth justified our disdain for others. I apologize. I know that an apology won't be enough, but I want you to know that I will no longer tolerate the lie. I will do whatever it takes to repair the damage. The silence that followed those words was almost sacred. Everyone understood that this was not just a family conflict, but a collective moral reckoning coming to light. Jacob and Olivia, from the back, nodded their heads, moved. Sarah and Clara remained close to Jenna, offering that silent yet firm support she so desperately needed. The atmosphere was suffocating, but at the same time, liberating. Julian, with his tired face and hunched back, lifted his gaze. His eyes reflected an ancient pain, embedded deep in his memory. With a hoarse voice, he spoke before the cameras. I was falsely accused, stripped of my share and my dignity. They denied me the right to explain myself, to defend myself. For years I sent letters asking for a response, a reunion, an apology. Nothing came. I was pushed into the street, into poverty, while you, he pointed his chin at George, enjoyed the fortune built on my work. Now, here, in front of everyone, I ask you, what will justify your cruelty? What arguments will silence the cries of the workers I defended, of the families evicted, of the honor that was tarnished? Julian's words were like daggers cutting through the flawless facade of the family. The journalists exchanged incredulous glances, their faces flushed with rage, frantically jotting down every phrase. The audience present could not contain their indignation. Some shouted "Justice!" from the back, others called for order, but the room was a boiling cauldron of emotions. In that chaos, Baron, his face drenched in cold sweat, chose to flee silently. Under the pretext of taking an urgent phone call, he discreetly exited through a side door, unable to face the truth. Some cameras caught him sneaking out, which only heightened suspicions. George, on the other hand, remained alone on the podium, mumbling incoherencies. He tried to justify himself. I didn't know. I was poorly advised. The company grew quickly and we couldn't. But his words were lost in a sea of critical voices and irrefutable evidence. Matthew seized the opening to deliver the final journalistic blow. You have here Julian, a despised co-founder. You have Hector, an internal witness. You have lawyer Sydney confirming the documents, Jenna apologizing, Eleanor acknowledging her silence. Will you continue denying the truth, Mr. George? Will you keep talking about philanthropy while the facts contradict you? George swallowed hard, unable to string together a coherent response. The weight of the evidence crushed him, the accusatory stares of the audience, the divided family, Eleanor and Jenna's tears, Julian's stoic dignity, the journalist's indignation. It had become the public trial he never imagined facing, and the verdicts were inescapable. The crowd demanded explanations with shouts of justice, truth, answers. The scandal was total. Social media was already exploding with images and live statements. It was too late to backtrack, to buy silence, to offer flashy checks that would soothe consciences. The truth had emerged, and like a lightning bolt lighting up a dark night, it revealed the shadows that had remained hidden for decades. At that moment, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same. The company, once a model of prestige, now faced an unprecedented moral crisis. The family, once impenetrable, was now exposed, with their weaknesses and lowliness on full display. And Julian, finally, regained his rightful place in history, restoring part of his dignity before the gaze of an entire nation. At the end of that whirlwind, there was no space for denial. The truth, relentless, had gained ground, and no one, not even George, could escape its consequences. The news of the scandal spread like an uncontrollable wildfire. Within hours, sensationalist headlines, debates on talk shows, and live broadcasts on social media turned the tale of the betrayed co-founder into the central topic of all conversations. The elegant facades of the business world were now stained with the mud of truth. To many, the family that had presented itself as exemplary was now naked before the critical eye of society. Meanwhile, in the room that moments earlier had been the stage for George and Baron's public humiliation, the chaos continued. Journalists tried to approach Julian, Jenna, Elena, Hector, anyone who could offer a final statement. The cameras sought to capture every gesture, every glance. Security agents tried to contain the tumult, but the press's insatiable curiosity was unstoppable. George, in a corner of the podium, realized with cold bitterness that he had lost control. All the prestige built on calculated donations, selective invitations, extravagant galas, and press releases filled with philanthropy was crumbling before the brutal simplicity of the facts. There was no rhetoric, no generous check, no public relations campaign that could contain the media fury now devouring his reputation. The company, its shareholders, its clients, all looked in horror as the perfect image shattered and turned to dust. The phones in the family offices were surely ringing non-stop. Shareholders, alarmed, would demand explanations. Some clients, in turn, would be re-evaluating their contracts, horrified by the moral deception that had sustained what had once been an untarnished brand. Employees who had felt proud to work there now felt embarrassed, humiliated, questioning how many more lies were buried in the institution's past. Jenna, in the midst of the chaos, stood off to the side, holding Clara's hand. The two had chosen a less crowded corner, away from the spotlight, observing the scene with sad eyes and heavy hearts. Jenna felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Though she hadn't planned the original lie, for years she had been a passive beneficiary of that deception. Her indifference, arrogance, and disdain for those who didn't share her status had contributed in some way to perpetuating the family myth. Now, at least, the truth was no longer hidden. That didn't alleviate all the guilt, but it gave her a starting point to try to change, to grow morally, and not remain trapped in the muck of appearances. Clara squeezed her arm affectionately in a silent gesture of comfort. The truth had come to light, and moral justice was underway. As painful as it was better than continuing in the deceit. Hector, to one side, observed with a lost gaze. He had had the courage to give his testimony, to confess his silent complicity. Now he looked at George and felt a mixture of pity and rage, sorrow and disillusionment. Still, he knew this collapse was necessary. The family could not lean on lies if it hoped for any moral decency. Julian remained standing, surrounded by cameras and microphones pointed at him. But the old man didn't deliver grand speeches or engage in media controversy. His presence, so human and painful, was enough to highlight the magnitude of the injustice he had endured. The press wanted to hear his reactions, to know if he would offer a magnanimous forgiveness that would cleanse the family's guilt. But Julian was not a product to redeem images. He owed no one forgiveness at that moment. Too many years without answers, too many nights in the cold, too many ignored letters. Pain doesn't disappear with a public apology or a fleeting gesture before the cameras. Elena, who had tried to approach Julian, sobbed uncontrollably. Her trembling hands, extended toward the man she had ignored, seemed to beg for a restorative hug. But Julian kept his distance. He didn't reject her with words, nor did he shout at her. He simply stood there, with a gaze full of infinite sadness, unable to pretend that everything could be fixed with a brief gesture. Jenna, watching the scene, understood the depth of the damage done. Her mother had cried, had confessed her cowardice, and yet Julian could not approach, could not break the barriers built over decades of abandonment and neglect. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would take time. It wasn't a matter of a single emotional moment for the cameras. It was an inner process that would require time, honesty, and perhaps years of effort to restore the humanity that had been lost. The press, tired of so much hypocrisy, grew impatient, loudly criticizing the family's behavior, the internal conspiracy, the vileness of those who had chosen wealth over dignity. They reported live for their channels and radio stations, announcing that the company was going through its worst reputational crisis and that the scandal of the betrayed co-founder was now a milestone in the country's economic and social history. Outside, the protests in the streets continued. Jacob and Olivia, along with other former employees, chanted slogans of justice. Several passers-by had joined in, moved by the revelation. The social atmosphere was charged with demands. Would there be compensation for the victims? Would they legally acknowledge Julian's contribution to the foundation of the company? Would they offer public apologies beyond the cameras? Inside the room, George tried to maintain his composure, but it was in vain. His family myth had collapsed. Opulence, superficial donations, social marketing, they had all proven to be what they were, an empty facade. Now he had to face unthinkable consequences, potential lawsuits, investigations, social repudiation. His empire was no longer built on solid foundations, but on the murky puddle of exposed injustice. Jenna, lost in her thoughts, felt that this collapse was both the end of a lie and the beginning of something else. Something more sincere, more honest, though painful. Rebuilding a relationship with Julian wouldn't be easy, nor repairing the harm caused to so many people. But at least she would no longer live in fantasy. She, Clara, Eleanor, Hector, all had made mistakes and now had the opportunity to acknowledge them without masks. The nobility of the truth lay in the fact that, no matter how much it hurt, it would allow imagining a different future without the burden of lies on their shoulders. As she watched Julian, silent among the sea of cameras, Jenna understood that the path to forgiveness was long. They would have to earn it with tangible actions, not last-minute words. They would need to rebuild bridges, heal wounds, compensate those who suffered. The false splendor of their surname had died, but perhaps with effort, new relationships based on respect, empathy, and genuine justice could emerge. The company, the world, the media, all were witnessing the collapse of the family myth. And amidst the rubble, each involved party had to decide what to do next. The truth was on the table, undeniable and bright. What happened next would depend on their ability to recognize guilt, take responsibility, and work hard to redeem, as much as possible, the damage caused. For now, Julian's forgiveness was not forthcoming. His silence was a reminder that certain wounds take time to heal. But that very absence of immediate forgiveness confirmed the authenticity of his pain. No one could buy his benevolence with a theatrical gesture. It would have to be earned, perhaps, with years of honesty and respect, with the firm promise never to repeat that cruelty disguised as success. As the cameras kept rolling and the news spread around the world, the myth crumbled, making way for an uncomfortable but necessary truth. In that space, perhaps, with time and effort, something better would flourish. The pressure had become a vice that tightened relentlessly. After the media scandal, street protests, and the mounting reports in the media, the company had no choice but to concede. In a subsequent press conference, this time without such polished scripts and forced smiles, the management announced a series of measures to mitigate the damage caused. They promised compensation to Julian and to all those who had been wronged in the past: Jacob, Olivia, and others whose names were barely known, but who had also suffered injustice. The company, now with its reputation in ruins, committed to reviewing its labor practices, implementing transparent policies, and opening internal reporting channels to prevent future abuses. It was a first step, perhaps more forced than sincere, but at least they could no longer hide behind indifference. Under the watchful eye of public opinion and the press, denying everything had ceased to be a viable option. Julian, upon learning of the compensations, showed neither euphoria nor resentment. He accepted it as a minimal act of justice, without applauding as if it were a favor. After decades of denial, reclaiming his name, his dignity, and material compensation felt more like a partial rebalancing of the scales than a gift. Now, at least, he was no longer a nameless vagabond. Society knew his truth, and his name would appear in records, no longer hidden behind accounting lies. When offered to return to the family mansion, Julian simply declined with a gentle gesture. He did not want to live within the walls that had hidden his memory. He also didn't need luxury cars or servants. Instead, he accepted a modest apartment paid for with an independent social fund, far from the opulence that hurt him so much to remember. He wanted a quiet existence, with the freedom to come and go without feeling the weight of a family that once erased him from the map. He did not want charity wrapped in glitter, but his own space, with the simple dignity of someone who can finally decide about his life without humiliation. Jacob and Olivia, upon receiving news of their compensation and the promise of fairer working conditions, felt a cautious relief. They were not sure of the company's sincerity, but it was impossible to deny that the protests, the revelation of the truth and social pressure had had an effect. Other affected individuals would also see their cases reviewed, and although many would distrust for a long time, at least a crack was opening through which justice could seep. In the mansion, the atmosphere was gloomy. George, with his pride wounded, couldn't hide his contained rage. His empire of image and prestige had cracked to the core. The company he considered his legacy now had to apologize, pay compensations, and admit moral crimes it had denied for years. Elena, her face marked by tears, could barely lift her gaze. She understood that her complicit silence had fed the monster that now devoured them. She wanted to comfort herself by thinking that at least they had done something, that the compensations and new policies were a way to repair, even if only partially, the damage. But she knew that remorse did not fade overnight. Jenna, however, felt a strange sensation. On one hand, shame still scratched at her soul. She had been part, through omission and disinterest, of that system of contempt. On the other hand, she felt relief knowing that, at least now, the company could no longer ignore the voices of the past. She had done the right thing when the opportunity arose. She had not clung to silence or comfort. The moral awakening had come late, but at least she had not slept through the catastrophe. Clara, beside her, squeezed her arm with discreet tenderness. Both knew that repairing such great harm was not a matter of a day or a single measure. It would require time, concrete actions, long-term consistency. But they could not deny that the lie had collapsed, that the arrogant pedestal had shattered, and that justice, though delayed, was emerging in fits and starts. Julian did not offer instant forgiveness. It was impossible for him. The wound was too deep to be closed with a few televised apologies. However, his mere presence, now recognized and respected, was a symbol that the truth had regained ground. Social respect was restoring part of his identity. He did not need to pose with the family or accept their luxuries. His freedom lay in being able to choose his life without the yoke of deceit. Jenna understood something fundamental. Justice was not a mere adornment for charity galas, nor was it a medal to hang to appear morally superior. Justice was a moral necessity, a pillar that gives meaning to society and human relationships. It was a requirement for inner peace, to free oneself from guilt. At least now a path had begun. Incomplete, full of doubts, but a path nonetheless. The company, forced by media and social pressure, had taken a step by acknowledging its moral crimes, promising material reparations and structural changes. It might be insufficient. The public might continue to doubt its sincerity for a long time, but they could no longer deny reality or reduce Julian to an uncomfortable rumor. His existence, his dignity, and his role in history were now unquestionable. That afternoon, as the cameras moved away and journalists sought new news, Jenna allowed herself a sigh. She felt the burden of the past on her shoulders, but also a slight sense of relief. She had done what was within her power to stop the machinery of deceit. In time, she hoped, perhaps the family could learn from their mistakes, and Julian, with the independence he so longed for, could find the peace that had been denied to him for so long. For now, the partial reparations were a patch, a fragile bridge between past injustice and an uncertain future. They did not guarantee forgiveness or perfect justice, but they were the first foundation of something more honest. And in that context, Jenna, Clara, and so many others who had awakened to the truth knew that there was no turning back to indifference. Moral responsibility would accompany them, and perhaps with effort, decency would prevail over the farce. As the days passed, the media storm began to lose intensity. The ever-hungry news outlets found new topics to consume. Nevertheless, the aftermath of the scandal remained present in the air, in people's looks, and in the decisions the family had to make each day. No one forgot what had happened, and although the fury had subsided, the consequences continued to weigh on each of those involved. In a modest small apartment, located in a quiet neighborhood, Julian had found his own space. The walls were painted in soft tones, and the decoration was simple, almost austere. A comfortable armchair, a wooden table marked by time, some books collected from second-hand markets, and in the window, a pot with a plant he had chosen himself. There he could breathe without feeling the weight of betrayal on his back, without the shadows of the past on his shoulders. He could finally live with autonomy and peace, without the condescending charity the family now offered, perhaps motivated by guilt. Elena, her heart oppressed by shame and regret, had tried to visit her father. She did so with hesitant steps, a bouquet of simple flowers in hand, not knowing if Julian would let her in. He opened the door without smiling, without expressing direct anger, but with undeniable distance in his gaze. The reunion was silent, tense. He did not throw her out, nor did he invite her to enter comfortably. He needed time to digest the betrayal and the indifference of so many years. Elena understood, cried as she left the building, aware that forgiveness, if it came, would not be immediate or easy. She accepted that healing the wounds would require patience, sincerity, and genuine acts, not just tears. Jenna, for her part, had chosen a different path. Far from parties and galas, far from frivolous criticisms, she now dedicated herself to collaborating at the soup kitchen that Clara managed. Her hands, once adorned with expensive rings, became stained with remnants of vegetables and hot soup. She served plates with dedication, conversed with those who came seeking food and human warmth. There, she discovered stories she would have previously overlooked. Unemployed individuals with talent, migrants with broken dreams, single mothers supporting their families with effort. Each person possessed a dignity that was not measured by their bank account, but by their intrinsic humanity. Jenna understood that justice was not a decorative concept to adorn charitable speeches, but a moral necessity that should accompany every decision. Therefore, while talking with Clara, she devised the possibility of creating a scholarship program for the children of humble workers. The idea was to offer them real opportunities without makeup or hypocritical charity. The change in her attitude was slow but authentic, like a seed germinating with deep roots. She left behind arrogance and embraced empathy, knowing it was a process with falls and stumbles, but convinced that it was the right path. Meanwhile, the family, once a monolith of prestige, now faced the consequences of their actions. George, withdrawn into a bitter silence, understood the magnitude of what was lost. His empire no longer shone with the same deceptive brilliance. The exposed lies demanded transparency, policy changes, and acts of contrition that no opulence could buy. They were no longer untouchable. Elena, carrying her shame, wondered each day how to rebuild the broken bridge with her father, how to earn a glimpse of forgiveness. Julian, in his quiet apartment, had not regained his entire family, but he had reclaimed a part of his name and his history. Now the world knew that he was not just any beggar, but a man unjustly stripped of his place. If he couldn't build healthy ties with those who betrayed him, at least he could choose whom to relate to, with whom to share a coffee or a conversation, without owing explanations or favors. The truth had come to light. It was an undeniable certainty. The mask of the perfect family had fallen, and society could see a group of people with flaws, fears, guilt, and needs for atonement. Although the wounds would take time to heal, the complicit silence had been broken, allowing honesty, humility, and the pursuit of mutual understanding to take root. In that atmosphere of change, Jenna, Sarah, Clara, Jacob, Olivia, and all those affected, directly or indirectly, prepared for a more honest future. There was pain, yes, but also the seed of hope born from sincerity. Justice could no longer be considered optional, nor could it be hidden behind ostentatious gowns or empty speeches. It was now understood that power carried responsibility and that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, was the only solid foundation upon which to build a more dignified tomorrow. Thus, the story concluded with an open door. No one promised perfect endings, instant forgiveness, or effortless reconciliations. What existed was something more valuable: the awareness that the truth circulates, that lies cannot stand impunely, and that humanity always needs the courage to face injustices head-on and correct them. With that certainty, each would move toward their own destiny, more honest, more human, without the suffocating burden of silence. And so we conclude this story that has shown us the liberating strength of truth and the importance of empathy in a world full of appearances. If there is something we can learn, it is that justice is not a mere adornment, nor second chances a luxury. Every person, regardless of their condition, deserves respect, dignity, and a voice that is not silenced. Thank you for joining us until the end. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Reflection is more enriching when built in community. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to discover more tales that, like this one, invite us to question the world we inhabit and to build bridges between guilt, truth, and redemption. Until the next video, where we will continue exploring stories that move us, challenge us, and inspire us to be more human.